Welcome to Clean Room. I'm going to take off the IDW. The controlled, a controlled environment for uncontrolled conversations. This is a book club on Cynical Theories by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, and Sam is, I can't say her last name, is hosting. I'm trying
It's
to get the
Hoadley-Brill.
stupid thing to go away. There you go. Cool. So part 3, this time the chapters are Queer Theory and Critical Race Theory. I found these chapters a lot easier to read than other chapters. Not necessarily in that the other chapters were difficult to read, but these chapters felt a little more directed and focused, and I didn't feel as distracted while I was reading them. Things didn't as easily distract me. I also felt like I had less contention with a lot of this stuff. But anyway, you ready, Sam?
Yeah, sure. So I actually went into, I've read the whole book, but I didn't read quite as carefully the chapters on applied postmodernism, because with the exception actually of the post-colonial theory chapter that I did, because I had some background in decolonial theory or philosophy, but that wasn't addressed in there. But I have no background in queer theory, so I sort of went through it and felt like, okay, sure, this seems plausible enough. And pretty much the same with the rest of the applied postmodernism chapters. But now, with having like more background on the original postmodernists themselves, specifically just basically Foucault, through conversations with a friend of mine who did his master's thesis on Foucault, I am sort of seeing the book in a new light a little bit. And I actually, last week I said that I thought I would have pretty much nothing to say about queer theory, the queer theory chapter. But as it turns out, I have much more to say about the queer theory chapter than the critical race theory chapter. So let's get into it. So the theory chapter begins on page 89, and it's interestingly structured sort of backwards compared to the rest of the applied postmodernism chapters. Those typically follow this general framework where they introduce the theory, they give a brief characterization of it, and then they go into exegesis of the thinkers or scholars who have been most instrumental in characterizing it. I'm gonna this light is fucking with me a little.
Yeah, you look like Jesus.
That's probably better.
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. So typically the applied postmodernism chapters they follow a basic sort of outline that goes, here's a introduction to the theory, and then let's get into the actual thinkers that pioneered it. So in the post-colonial theory chapter, we have they start with discussion of Said. They mention a few other thinkers who sort of were like the godfather, right? They call Frantz Fanon the godfather of post-colonial theory. And then they get into the discussion of the actual sort of the creators, and those are Said, Spivak, and Baba. This time, though, we also have 3 sort of pioneers of queer theory, and that's Rubin, Judith Butler, and Eve Sedgwick. But we don't get into discussion of them until later in the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
What we do get in the beginning of the chapter is a sort of all-encompassing sketch of what queer theory says and what queer theory does. So, what do they say? Well, Pluckrose and Lindsay start by telling us that queer theory is about liberation from the normal, especially where it comes to norms of gender and sexuality. This is because it regards the very existence of categories of sex, gender, and sexuality to be oppressive. Okay, so hopefully we'll see some examples of queer theorists saying that the very categories are oppressive. And they say that in the next paragraph, queer theory presumes that oppression follows from categorization, which arises every time language constructs a sense of what is normal by producing and maintaining rigid categories of sex, gender, and sexuality, and scripting people into them. These seemingly straightforward concepts are seen as oppressive, if not violent, and so the main objective of queer theory is to examine, question, and subvert them in order to break them down. This is page 90 now. This is all done in ways that explicitly rely on the postmodern knowledge principle, which rejects the possibility that an objective reality is attainable. I thought attainable was a weird choice of words there. I guess it's supposed to mean something like accessible. And the postmodern political principle, which understands society to be structured in unjust systems of power that reinforce and perpetuate themselves. Okay, so just want to note first off the bat that, again, I'm pretty sure I brought this up last week as well. There's a frequent vacillation in this book between two conceptions of the postmodern political principle. One is one that just says that society is structured by systems of power that sort of determine what can be known. And the other one says the same thing, but it says that those systems of power are unjust. There's a huge difference between the two. Here in the beginning of the queer theory chapter, we get the formulation that says unjust systems of power. And that seems to be important, right? Why would you want to subvert the categories of gender, sex, and sexuality unless those have been constructed unjustly? Later on in the chapter, though, we come back to the postmodern political principle, and it's given in the ordinary sense, where it doesn't suppose that it's unjust. So we'll come back to that later, but I thought it was just worth pointing out as we get started. So then they give us the next section is a brief history of queer theory, or it's the first section, right, that they actually label. And they're just sort of giving us a little history. They say that it was deeply influenced, queer theory was deeply influenced by the AIDS crisis of the 80s. And then it says, look, actually, queer theory has a good starting point, which is that we have changed the way that we see sexuality profoundly. And it acknowledges sort of some points that are central to Foucault's history of sexuality, particularly that it wasn't always the case that we saw sexuality in terms of part of someone's identity, right? It wasn't always the case that there were homosexuals and heterosexuals rather than homosexuality or homosexual practices and heterosexual practices. And they say that this idea that people really are gay or straight rather than engaging in gay or straight activities began to gain recognition in the 19th century. And then they say that over the second half of the 20th century, this attitude shifted again. Well, they're saying the attitude shift. Let me just read the previous point, sorry. They said that public perception of homosexuals gradually started to shift due to the rise of sexology at the end of the 19th century, and by the middle of the 20th century, homosexuals were regarded less as corrupt degenerates who required punishment, and more as shamefully disordered individuals who required psychiatric treatment. Then, quoting them again, over the second half of the 20th century, this attitude shifted again until a dominant liberal discourse around homosexuality, which still holds the moral high ground today, evolved. This attitude is best summed up as, some people are gay, get over it. I haven't taken a recent look at like the statistics or the sort of the surveys, but the idea that by the end of the 20th century, the dominant attitude was some people are gay, get over it. Well, then why wasn't gay marriage legal in most places or almost any places in the United States? I'd like to see like at least
Well, I
some
mean,
evidence for the idea.
you could make the same argument about marijuana, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say the default idea about marijuana right now is people smoke pot, get over it, but it's still illegal.
Well, right, it's still federally illegal, and I don't know in terms of like a majority wise, like how many states have either decriminalized or made it legal. Um, so you're right, like just the fact that it wasn't legal isn't enough. Um, but I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that by like the year 2000, people were the dominant attitude was like, oh yeah, it's fine to be gay, like uh, get over it. Like, that may be true, in which case I just like to see the evidence for it.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't give any
All right,
statistics or
it's
anything like
definitely
that.
simplifying because even if it's people that think it's okay to be gay, maybe they look downly upon, like they would look downly upon, someone that's gay. So I mean, it's oversimplifying what's the actual reality of it.
How about this? Would
Mhm.
would you be willing to say at least this is generally true? In 2000s, in 2000, if your faith was that homosexuality was a sin punishable by death, that was pretty clearly publicly unacceptable.
Yeah, I would say that. Hopefully, I hope that's true. Yeah, and I'm inclined to think, yes, that by 2000, most people in the United States thought that gay people should not be punished by death for being gay.
Do you think most people
yes,
thought that gay people shouldn't be punished at all?
By 2000? I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, I mean, I have gay parents, right? My moms are lesbian, and I was born in 1997. And growing up, I mean, I grew up in Southern California in a pretty liberal bubble, and the general vibe that I got from like most people was something like, "Oh, that's cool, like whatever." But like that doesn't mean that the country was like that, right? I mean, I'm growing up in one of the most liberal parts of the country. So
I want to. Somebody in the comments said, "Who has to get over it?" And I said, "Anyone who has a problem with it." And they said, "Well, then I guess some people still have a problem with it." And to that, I would say that's way too high a threshold. Like that can't be the threshold by which we decide the problem is solved. I mean, that's impossible because I mean, people have a problem with things that I am. And
right. No, first, yeah. First today, people still have a problem with it, and I would think that the majority of Americans today don't have a problem with it, or at least would, if asked on a survey, would say it's fine, right? Whether they actually have like some sort of problem with it is ultimately something that we'll never know for sure. But like, come on, give me some evidence. If you're gonna say that towards the end of the 20th century, people were like, "Yeah, some people are gay. Get over it. Come on." Like, I need some evidence,
Fair enough.
So, let's see. Then, what page are we on? We're on page 91. And yes, then it says, while there have been some dramatic changes in how we regard homosexuality over the last century and a half, our understanding of sex and gender has changed much less. We have generally always understood our species as overwhelmingly consisting of two sexes, and gender as mostly
oh my God.
Going on and on and on.
I'm sorry.
Then the the next issue that I have is that they say, so this is on page 92, towards the bottom of the second big paragraph, they say that right. Let's see. Similar changes resulted from the gay rights and eventually pride and trans movements, which is most people take issue with like distinguishing those things, like saying like gay pride rather than just pride, because gay pride makes it sound like it's not inclusive of like that it's not also like a movement for like trans equality. I'm not sure the extent to which pride itself was originally dedicated to that. And I know that like the concepts of being trans have sort of evolved over time, and that, for instance, I think I may be wrong about this, that like Marsha P. Johnson would not have called herself a trans woman back in the day, but that people nowadays do. I don't know the extent to which that's justified, because I just don't have as much knowledge about the history as other people do. But then, yeah, so they say, even though most of these changes, the changes of removing many legal and cultural barriers for LGBT people, even though most of these changes were the result of recognizing the biological roots of sex, gender, and sexuality. What? People's deciding that they were okay with gay people was a response to our understanding of the biology involved? Was it not a result of sort of activism, like based on like the activism with the Stonewall movement, and all of the organizations that were created in response to that to try to address oppression of LGBT people? What did biology have to do with this?
Well, I mean, I really feel like the most convincing argument that I remember was that people are born gay. They're born with they don't have to be necessarily born homosexual. They could be bi or whatever, but their attraction to other people is not socialized.
Right, that this is sort of, it's not a choice. I was born this way, Lady Gaga.
Yeah, right. So if that's
but like,
if that's an argument, if that is a acceptable argument, doesn't it argue against trans?
I don't. Well, I mean, so there's a couple different conceptions about gender identity. Some people think gender identity is completely determined by like socialization. Other people argue like the term is out of date, at least in medical context now, I think. But the term used to be not transgender but transsexual, which is sometimes now used as a more narrow term within the broader umbrella term of transgender. Well, so some people argue that like I was born with a male brain in a female body, and
but doesn't
so that would be akin to a biological understanding.
This is one of the things that okay, I'm asking this genuinely. I don't understand how on the one hand you could say gender is a social construct, and on the other hand you could say I was born with a male brain. I mean, either it can't
No,
be...
you can't, right. No, yeah, so I'm saying these are two different approaches.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's clearly contradictory.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of... I don't want to skip ahead, but a lot of their point here is queer theory itself seems very self-contradictory on purpose. Because it's...
That's right, that is their point. We'll get to like whether I think that they substantiate that well enough, but...
well,
Sam,
right, I think... if Lindsay and Pluckrose, they have a lot of faith in like the neoliberal like secular order. And I think they think that they give that credit for taking religion, like, you know, beating religion in these questions, and they give that credit for like the gay rights movement, like the fact that like our secular society, you know, defeated the religious people who thought being gay was a sin. But I think that would be their argument.
And I think that would be a bit oversimplified, right? Because I mean, do you think that what really happened was that like more people realized that like, oh well, if Christianity says being gay is wrong, I can't be a Christian? Or was it that like more Christians realized that being gay that like sort of hating people for being gay was actually sort of contradictory to some of the more basic principles of Christianity.
I think a lot of things happen. I don't think it's insignificant what happened with the Catholic priests. I don't think that is a insignificant factor. How do you contend with that? That like your priests are having sex with young altar boys? I mean, I'm not trying to conflate homosexuality and pedophilia at all. I'm just saying.
No, I know. I'm just like, I don't know. Like, it seems like all of this is a bit speculative. So to try to attribute it to any one particular thing, like they do with like liberalism, right? Like just.
I think the charitable thing they're saying about liberalism is it has been extremely effective in making things better for a massive amount of people. So if there are things that are anti-liberal,
I mean,
that is a concern.
Was it really liberalism? Because like the protests, like the Stonewall riots that actually led to, that sort of put pressure on politicians to actually like finally decriminalize homosexual behavior, those things weren't very liberal. It's not very liberal to like throw bricks into the walls
No.
and like into police cars, right? Like,
is that, I mean, I'm doing to you what you do to the book. Is that really, can you really put that closely, connect the dots that tightly to the protests with bricks?
The Stonewall riots?
Yeah.
I mean, from the history that I have read, like it seems to be a clear consensus view that these actually did lead to significant changes in the legislation, like that people finally, that it was.
Well, I mean, I guess
it drew attention from sort of it drew attention to what was happening to homosexual people, that is like being arrested for like having gay sex and for like being like displaying public affection with a partner of the same sex.
Okay. I'm gonna.
It sort of brought public attention to it.
I recognize I'm moving the goalposts, so you can call me out for that, and you don't have to respond to it. But do you think that type of protest would the people who were involved in that, would they have ever had any ability or thought to do that without liberalism?
Well, I mean, so I don't know, but that's not it, like the point I'm trying to make here is not that like exactly like you recognize, I'm glad you recognize that you're moving the goalpost, because the question is not whether these things could have ever happened in a society that's not structured by liberalism, but the question of whether liberalism is really like the agent of change here. Like it's happening within a liberal society, broadly speaking, but does the mechanism by which the change is motivated, right? The riots, the Stonewall riots, does that not contradict the basic principles of liberalism, which says, advocate for peaceful reform, like reform, not revolution, whereas the riots were clearly against the principles of liberalism, it seems to me.
Well, I think it kind of connects to like the Democratic Party. Like I forget who was it, like McGovern that ran against Nixon. Like Nixon was like kind of this like figure of the establishment, and so the Democratic Party like always kind of like the anti-war people, they always kind of aligned with like the secular or like the liberal people, the leftists too in the Democratic Party. So as their party like kind of gained power over the years, they've always been kind of leftist issues are like multiculturalism. So as they grew in power and won elections and presidencies, they preached their positions of multiculturalism, and they eventually won out. So I think they probably deserve a lot of credit for a lot of these victories.
The liberal, like the Democratic Party,
Yeah, that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
but they didn't support homosexuality until the 21st century.
It's a
Like
similar.
Hillary Clinton, even in the 2008 election, opposed
Yeah.
gay marriage.
Yeah, I know.
It is true.
I think
Barack Obama ran against gay marriage.
Yeah.
He did.
So
Yeah,
But they always had people that, we're for everyone.
right, the people who were
diversity.
for it were on their side, but that doesn't mean that they were for it.
Yeah, that's a good point that Barack Obama ran against gay marriage. It's funny too because I want to say when I'm moving the goalposts, I'm aware that I'm doing it every time I do it. I know that, but I'm doing it for a reason. I'm doing it because in an academic sense, I'm moving the goalposts. In an everyday person's perspective of the world, I'm broadening the context to make it clear, to make it understandable the way that I think most people see it. What I'm saying is, I think most people would say, well, I can see the connection with liberalism because I don't think that let's say that people would, in a dictatorship or in another form of government, if gay people were throwing bricks through windows, I don't know that there would be a mechanism by which that would enact change. It would.
Yeah, they might get shot.
Yeah.
They might just all shoot everyone.
Exactly. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. I'm with you I agree with you that like you can't say it's entire liberalism. Can I respond to a comment in the chat? I'm gonna put it on screen.
Sure.
By the way, did it come up on screen? I have it so I can't see. By the way, something can be biological and a social construct. Consider being a good basketball player. I agree with this. I wasn't claiming that things are either biological or social construct. I actually don't believe there's very few things, in my opinion.
Like not at all socially constructed.
There's very few things that are not both. I don't think gender is one or the other. I don't think anything is one or the other. I can't think of many things that are one or the other. Your hair color is genetic, right? But like any thoughts we have about redheads is clearly socially constructed. So I agree with that point. What I was saying about the biological argument was, if that was an argument made as to why being gay is okay, it causes problems for arguments that trans people actually are the other. I guess it's hard to talk about this.
Yeah. Let's get to that stuff when we get to the gender stuff more.
Yeah.
Right now, so the point I was trying to bring up here though was they say that removing many legal and cultural barriers for LGBT people were the result, or most of these changes were the result of recognizing the biological roots of sex, gender, and sexuality, and the attitudes involved were broadly liberal and individualist. Even though that's true, they are taken as evidence of the social constructedness of gender and sexuality by queer theorists, especially those with a feminist perspective. And they say, for example, the gap between sex and gender has been taken as evidence that gender, and then they say, and even sex, are social constructions. And then their endnote says the following. This is endnote 2 for queer theory. Their endnote says, there are cultures that have perceived a third sex or a multitude of genders. These largely seem to be ways to think about people who don't fit into the expected categories of masculine man attracted to women and feminine woman attracted to man, and have generally been regarded as outliers from a prevailing norm, with roots deeply embedded in the biological realities of a sexually reproducing species. Okay, then give me some evidence of this general regard. Like what there are many cultures who have who don't have a binary conception of gender, right? Whether or not they have a binary conception of sex. The point, the whole value of having a concept of gender outside of the concept of sex is that gender is supposed to refer to the more socially constructed aspects of the sex-based differences, right? There are different gender roles across different societies, and some societies have more than 2 gender roles. They have a third gender, which is either non-binary or is supposed to be some sort of fusion between the 2 more common binary genders of man and woman. And Pluckrose and Lindsay just sort of bring it up, and then they say, but actually, these are generally regarded as like just a sort of whatever, like just it, like if it's true that other societies have a third gender, that seems to be pretty clear evidence that gender is a social construct, that there are different societies which have socially constructed gender in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I find that even hard to contest. Well, I can find it easy to contest that it is entirely socially constructed. So, like, I actually, again, tell me to shut up if I'm pushing it too far away. But, like, I think race is obviously only a social construct.
Okay.
It might be influenced by like how the categories came, but I have a hard time seeing gender, even if there's 3 of them, as not being somewhat correlated with sex. Meaning the things that
so
are...
it can be correlated with sex.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean it's not socially constructed.
Well, okay. I have a thought in my head, but I can't figure out how to say it. So I will think on that, and I will respond as we continue.
I just wanted to raise, like, this seems like the way that they just casually dismiss societies with third genders seems like a pretty clear weakness of they're sort of taking it for granted that, like, gender is not a social construct. And then here's, like, the best argument against that claim, that there are societies, entire societies, which have, like, for generations, for hundreds or thousands of years, have acknowledged a gender outside the gender binary. Oh shit, apparently Ruth Bader Ginsburg just died.
Oh dear.
Joe? Is that true?
Yeah.
No way.
This is true.
The story broke like 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
That is big.
Rest in peace.
That is big.
Our
news.
democracy is done. Okay.
That's
I am...
Amy Coney Barrett.
2020 just took
You know, this is a real opportunity for Trump to be unifying if he were to say, let's wait until after the election. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, good.
I'm predicting that it doesn't matter, and that if Trump wins re-election, that there will be like shootings and bombings.
Oh, definitely.
I'm
For sure. If Trump
extremely
wins, yeah.
cynical.
I'm going to allow this
Well,
conversation to go a
guys.
little bit. I think we can.
Wait, no, look,
No, you don't want to? Fine.
it's get too fast. It's gonna go off too fast.
Okay, fair.
I mean, I just saw it and I had to react to it at all. But
No, totally fair.
so my point I was trying to say was that, like, so their position is like, look, it's ridiculous to say that gender is a social construct, and then the best argument against that view, it seems to my mind, is that, look, here are a bunch of different societies that have different conceptions of gender than we do, right? They don't have gender as a binary. And so how can we say that it's not a social construct? And then they say, how exactly do they phrase it? They say that these largely seem to be ways to think about people who don't fit into the expected categories of masculine man attracted to women and feminine woman attracted to men. And they have generally been regarded as outliers from a prevailing norm, with roots deeply embedded in the biological realities of a sexually reproducing species. Like, if you're gonna, like, dismiss the strongest objection to your view in an end note in a couple of sentences with a remark about what has generally been regarded, then at the very least you should provide some sources that constitute evidence for that rejection of this objection.
I think that's fair. I don't have any objection to that. I think that's totally fair.
Okay, if no one else does,
I have
guess
like a
we...
meta thing that's like kind of related, but not really. I would say like the book usually tries to do two things. It's trying to like talk to like, you know, the layman and give them like a description of here what's going on with this topic of cynical theories, and that it's saying, oh, here's why it's wrong. So like that's mainly what the book is trying to do. And it seems like a lot of your critiques, the book would have been better to ignore kind of the layman and just say, all right, here's why it's wrong, and give their best argument for why it's wrong, and then think of, you know, the objections to that argument and why the objections are wrong, and just, you know, like kind of make like, you know, their best argument for why they're right. And the book definitely is not that. The book is not like, you know, it's kind of like definitely trying to give us you know, like a course in what the hell is going on with queer theory. So if they spend as much time on that, maybe they would, you know, have more time to just, you know, make their case.
Well, what you're saying makes sense to me. But I think so. Just to get clear, are you saying that, like, look, they're trying to do two things? They're trying to give ordinary people who are not academics an idea of what's going on in these fields, and they're trying to explain what's wrong with them? And you can't.
Right, like,
there's not enough space to do both.
You're more well read in this stuff than me, but like I've like heard like, you know, feminists online, and they like, you know, when they have, you know, I've heard most of the arguments that Lindsay and Pluckrose are making against this kind of stuff in before, and you know, feminists do have like some like halfway coherent responses to their critiques. And you know, a lot of Lindsay and Pluckrose's like arguments are kind of the first ones that, you know, Sargon of Akkad thinks of when he, you know, makes his video or whatever. They're not like, it's not like, you know, they're not like, this isn't like new stuff that, you know, Lindsay and Pluckrose are pointing out here. Like everyone bashes, you know, queer theory for thinking there's, you know, 100 different genders. Like everyone does that, and they do that, you know.
Well, I mean, like, the question is whether they can cite some scholars who make that kind of claim, or whether that kind of claim is coming from online internet activists or Tumblr users who have either taken the theory beyond what it actually says, or have misinterpreted the theory somehow, you know. And the book is supposed to give us an explanation of what the theory and the theorists who originally espoused the theory are actually saying, right?
Yeah, the book, I mean, the book definitely tries to do that.
And it seems to me that a lot of this stuff goes beyond that. So, I mean, we're actually just about to get into that. So, on page 93, let's see. Page 93, they talk about biopower, which they characterize as the power of scientific biological discourses. I don't think that's right. We might as well get into it now. I had it originally slated to come up later about how they understand biopower. So I just went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the entry on Michel Foucault to see how they, on the Stanford Encyclopedia, characterize biopower. So according to that, Foucault contrasts biopower to what he calls sovereign power, which is sovereign power is a form of power that was historically founded on violence, the right to kill. It was exercised mainly by taking something away. They can impose a tax on products, goods, and services, or by demanding a portion of the subject's time, strength, and ultimately life itself. So that's sovereign power. And then Foucault claims that biopower, sovereign power, has gradually been replaced by biopower, which is a form of power that exerts a positive influence on life, which it endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply life, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. So the exercise of power over living beings no longer carries the threat of death, but instead takes charge of their lives. So this is the conception of biopower, apparently, that Foucault is actually putting forward. And of course, biological scientific discourses will be relevant to biopower, but biopower is not just the power of scientific discourses. It has it has a huge array of different influences it can exert over the population of a state or a nation. But yeah, I mean, we should probably just come back to that later when I think it gets more relevant. They're just sort of introducing it on page 93. But then they say that these queer theorists seem to have missed the point that biologically legitimizing sex, gender, and sexuality statuses tends to lead people to become more accepting rather than less, and that such discourses are no longer misused to exclude and oppress. I mean, come on, right? Like, there's to claim that science is no longer misused to exclude and oppress gay people, lesbian people, transgender people, etc.
Well, what do you
like
mean?
Really, like, have we not seen like the whole rise in TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, right, who use like, oh, woman equals biological or adult human female, right? And this is literally using the discourse of like mainstream biology to say that there's no such thing as a transgender woman.
I don't think that's their claim, though. I don't think that's their claim. TERF's claim is that there are differences between men and women, and biological men and women. I'm talking about sex, and that women, the sex, should be allowed to have spaces that exclude trans women.
Right. And
I don't think that's oppression.
Then the point that they say, such discourses are no longer misused to exclude and oppress. So you could have like a nice polite TERF who makes like the point very clear and says, look, I'm not saying that there's no trans women. I'm just saying that like we need only females in the bathroom or whatever, and I don't want to exclude you from anything else, right? But like the claim that these discourses are no longer used at all to exclude and oppress, misused, they say, to exclude and oppress, seems clearly wrong.
It's too strong.
So how is that oppressing them to claim they can't be in a women's bathroom?
No, I'm saying that like that does not itself constitute oppression, but that there are much stronger versions of this exclusion that like clearly do exclude trans women, and whether you want to use the word oppress or not is up to you.
I see what you're saying. You're saying it's too vast a statement. It's too universal a statement to say that it doesn't exist. It's just too far.
Too optimistic. Yeah.
Okay, fair.
It's
but I mean, could we at least agree? What if they had said is generally frowned upon?
I mean, I don't know, like how do we assess whether something is generally frowned upon? Because, for instance, J.K. Rowling has these views that she comes out with, and they get a huge backlash from the trans community, but they also get a huge wave of support from the anti-trans community.
Well, I mean, I don't think anything J.K. Rowling said was objectionable or oppressive.
Well, I mean, of course, you may not think that. Other people do think that. So
They can
there's gonna
think it's
be
objectionable,
energy.
but I mean, to say that anything she said is oppressive is like such a stretch.
People have very different conceptions of what oppression is and how.
Well, then I guess
how
James, then Lindsay,
grand-
Lindsay and Pluckrose can have different ideas about what isn't a problem. I mean, that seems a little too relativist for me.
Relativist. I don't think it's relativist. I think it's just a dispute over the scope of something like oppression. It's not relativist. They don't think like whether it's oppressive depends on your conception of oppression. Like they think there's a fact of the matter and they have this conception of oppression and other people don't, and they think other people are wrong.
Well, if there's a
Anyways,
fact of
this
the
is-
matter, we would have to talk. We'd have to agree on what oppression is. Because I
Well,
don't.
we wouldn't have to agree on it. You might think that we would have to agree on it, but they would say, no, you can disagree with my conception of oppression. You're wrong. Like this is just like it's common way of looking at.
Yeah, but you would have to.
disputes philosophically.
What is your?
I guess here's the question:
definition of-
What
I mean,
has
what
J.K.
is their
Rowling?
definition of oppression?
What has J.K. Rowling said that's oppressive? Now, I can see why I can see why things she said are
So
objectionable.
it all depends on the definition of oppressive that you use. So common nowadays in social philosophy is to say that oppression doesn't have to be like systemic or like institution based. It can have to like something can be oppressive as just sort of mannerisms from everyday walk of life type of thing. Now you might just disagree with this conception of oppression, but
Well, see, okay, so here's my point. Somebody in the chat says, but the question isn't about what oppression is; it's about whether scientific discourse is used. Well, you're allowed to use the question is about oppression. Using scientific discourse to make an argument is not oppression by itself. You could the claim is that
no, not by itself necessarily, right? Yeah.
The claim is that scientific discourse is not. I agree with you. They go too far in saying is never being used to oppress anyone. I think that's too far. I'm sure you can find somebody somewhere who is oppressing their daughter with an idea about science. I mean, I don't doubt that at all. I don't have a problem admitting that. But I do when you bring up
I mean, one like thing that comes to mind is like Charles Murray's like blacks have lower IQs, therefore we shouldn't spend as much on their education kind of argument. Like some people would say he's using like science to keep the black man down. Like,
yeah, it seems like a clear example to me. Like the race IQ stuff, I would submit that there's a ton of that going on where
actually,
people don't understand the studies that they're actually citing and taking it to be clear evidence that like race X is inferior to race Y or something like that.
Okay, so what this person in the chat is saying, and it is important, so I'm bringing it up. They're saying the question isn't about what oppression is, it's about whether the scientific discourse is used. And then they said, sorry, used to argue against the inclusion of people. Why is using science to argue against the inclusion of people necessarily oppressive? I don't think that it is.
No, right, but no. To clarify, I think this person's response is that the sentence in the chapter is such discourses are no longer misused to exclude and oppress. So you can make a distinction between exclusion and oppression. So whether they're
I have a hard time seeing any acceptable way to hear what J.K. Rowling said as oppression. I can't think of a single way that it could possibly be considered oppression.
Okay, cool. But exclusion is a different thing as well, right?
No, fair. But let's stick to oppression then. How could it even be perceived as oppression?
I'd need to have the transcript in front of me or the article in front of me, and I don't have it in front of me. I think we're getting a little bit off topic here, and I mean it's already been 40 minutes, 50 minutes.
Yeah. Yep. 50 minutes.
So, okay. So, the next section they say, to queer verb, the queer noun, right? And also, again, they still haven't given us any examples of queer theorists saying that, science is oppressive or that these categories are oppressive. They haven't given us any examples yet. Then they say, at the end of the first paragraph of this new section, middle of page 93, this to the queer theorist, which is, when they're saying this, they're talking about the categories that seem so obvious to us now: male, female, masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual. They claim are socially constructed by dominant discourses. This, to the queer theorist, is reason to believe not only that we will be able to think and speak about and categorize sex, gender, and sexuality differently in the future, but also that we may consider such categories largely arbitrary and nearly infinitely malleable. Okay? If they think so, I'd love to see a citation that they think that they're infinitely malleable.
Wow.
This is where the word queer comes in. They say that queer refers to anything that falls outside binaries, like male, female, masculine, feminine, and to a way of challenging the links between sex, gender, and sexuality. They say, to be queer allows someone to be simultaneously male, female, or neither, to present as masculine, feminine, neuter, or any mixture of the three, and to change any of these identities at any time, or to deny that they mean anything in the first place. Again, love some citations. It's strange that we don't have any at all yet. They say queer theory is a political project, and its aim is to disrupt any expectations that people should fit into a binary position with regard to sex or gender. They say instead, we should defy simple categorization. In general, then, queer theory's political agenda is to challenge what is called a normativity, that some things are more common or regular to the human condition, thus more normative from a social, thus moral perspective than others. And then they say that these queer theorists are intentionally conflating two meanings of normative and deliberately making strategic use of the moral understanding of the term to contrive problems with its descriptive meaning. Now, I actually think that Pluckrose and Lindsay are the ones conflating here, because they're saying that queer theory is challenging normativity, the idea that some things are more common or regular to the human condition, and thus, because they're more common, that they're more normative, that people should actually do them. I don't think that queer theorists are challenging the idea that these things are more common, but they're challenging the ideas of something like heteronormativity, which would be the idea that people should be heterosexual, right? And that people should identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. I don't think queer theorists are pushing back on the claim that, like, most people in society seem to identify with these. On the contrary, they make that the premise of their entire project, right? Is most people do identify with these things, but why is that the case?
My pushback is always going to be outside of academia, because that's where I see it. And I do think
that's the problem, right? That's the problem with this whole thing, is because this chapter is not supposed to be outside of academia. This is supposed to be queer theory from the scholars.
I guess. But I mean, that's like the same argument as saying that Antifa means anti-fascist, and that's where that came from. I mean, it's...
Well, does Antifa have like an academic basis?
No, I'm just...
Like,
I'm just saying...
Who coined Antifa in the academy?
I'm just saying, outside... Now, I'm not making an argument about the academy. I'm making an argument about what things are. And what things are different to different people. You're talking about academia. To a lot of people, if a theory...
They're talking about academia. That's
Okay.
why I am.
Okay. So would these people think that it's... Would they be encouraging, or would they be discouraging, or would they be indifferent to a parent who decided that they were going to raise their child based on the way that they were born? They're gonna have blue walls. They're gonna have trucks. They're gonna encourage them to be attracted to women. They're going to, like, is that a problem?
I would suspect so. Yeah, I think that they would take issue with that.
Well, then that's sort of the point. It is a sort of attack on that then.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between claiming that like parents shouldn't raise their kids with a certain expectation and claiming that all categories are oppressive.
You
right?
can't
So
raise your kid
Lindsay
without
and Pluckrose
expectations.
Of course you can't raise your kid without any expectations, but the expectations can be the expectations they don't have to enter into the arena of what gender they're attracted to.
Okay. And okay. This is where I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, but like, do you think that it is possible for a professor to teach a bunch of students without their personal opinions being part of what's being taught?
Well, what do you mean by personal opinions?
Do you think that there's any chance that what is written down is different from what is being taught?
Sure. I mean, it's going to largely depend on the subject matter of the course.
I would find it objectionable if I was sending my kid to college and spending money on it, and they were being taught that they were oppressed because I taught them that they were a girl.
Okay.
I think that's closer to what they're talking about. I mean, I get your criticism. They're aiming too high because they're trying to take out the theory. I agree with you on that.
That's the whole point of the book. The point of the book is to say, look, we need to explain. So the point of the book is to say, look, the crazy scholarship and the crazy activism that has like taken over our society and is threatening to undermine it at its basic foundation, that comes from the academy, and it comes from postmodernism and in its three waves: original postmodernism, applied postmodernism, and reified postmodernism. And this is all academic. This all comes from the academy. So to justify the claims that they're making in these chapters about scholarship, they can't turn to popular interpretations. If they wanted to criticize what's wrong with like cringy Twitter leftists who are misappropriating these theories, then they should have written a book about cringy Twitter leftists, not academics.
And I know, well, there are academics, but your point is they're not in the field of philosophy. Right?
Well, that's one of my points coming later, but my point
like
here is...
Kendi is a problem, or like, I think he's...
Yeah, no objection to that. No, I think Ibram Kendi's ideas about like his basic definition of racism is wrong, and it's silly. I have no problem with that, but they're not talking about Kendi in this book.
No.
They're talking about
the theory.
They're talking
itself.
about specific fields.
Yeah.
And so if they want to criticize the theory itself, then they need to quote the theorists and show me an example of a queer theorist who says that every category is inherently oppressive, because I don't see that yet.
Yeah, I do want to push back because the same person in the comments says we can't criticize thinkers according to what we assume they say in class. There has to be some evidence for the thing being criticized. I think there's more than enough evidence that there are professors who are teaching their students some crazy things.
Sure, but that's way more general than the specific
no argument.
target here.
I'm not gonna. I don't disagree with you on that. I do agree with you that like trying to take this out at the philosophical level is honestly kind of foolish, because
I would say I think it's possible their narrative, it's possible it's true. They don't, as Sam is pointing out constantly, they don't have enough evidence to back it up. But I would disagree a little bit that it's like inconceivable that their narrative for how it is true.
No, I didn't say it's inconceivable, right? I would never say it's inconceivable. If it is correct, then they should just be able to give us evidence.
It's going to be a difficult thing to provide evidence. I mean, I don't know how you could do it, to be honest. I think it's I think, like I brought it up, I think
Well,
last
I
time,
think-
that like Coddling of the American Mind is a better book because it's talking about specific things that are happening on campuses and why those things are a problem. It is not attacking theory or the philosophy
Right,
department.
right.
And no, I'm with you on that. Hey Sam, can you do me a favor? Can you disable your camera and re-enable it?
Yeah.
Boop, 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 boop. Whoa.
Is it working?
Yeah, it's really choppy, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's probably just my Wi-Fi.
No worries, man. I just wanted to see if that would do it. It
All right.
stopped blinking. That's a lot better, actually.
That's good. So then, finally, on page 95, they say that queer theory is essentially about. So we have an essential. Finally, the essence of queer theory. It's essentially about the belief that to categorize gender and sexuality or anything else, right? Queer theory says categorizing anything is to legitimize one discourse, the normative one, as knowledge, and to use it to constrain individuals. And it addresses this problem in postmodern ways. Okay, so essentially, queer theory says categorizing gender and sexuality or anything is legitimizing one discourse as knowledge and using it to constrain individuals. Whew. I guess there's two ways you could take that. One way is to say that, yeah, as a basic like definition of what it is to categorize something, you're saying that if I say like that this is a microphone, right? Then yes, I'm legitimizing one discourse, the discourse that calls these things microphones, and I'm legitimizing that as knowledge, and I'm using it to constrain individuals in the sense that when someone says microphone, I take them to be referring to these kinds of things. So if that's true, then okay, who fucking cares? We already knew that. But the other way to take it, the stronger way, is to say that to categorize anything is like oppressive. So like when I say that this is a microphone, I'm oppressing the people who want to use microphone in a more expansive sense to refer not only to microphones but to non-microphones. I just have no idea. If it's the first one, then yeah, it's trivially true. If it's the second one, then that's a very radical claim, and I'd like to see some evidence for it.
No, I am actually with you on that. I didn't think I would be as much with you in your criticisms as I have been through this book club. I think that it's frustrating from my end because I think they could have made some really good points had they had the correct target. I think that they're Icarus. They're flying too close to the sun. They're not going to be successful in their endeavor because, honestly, I almost don't want them to be successful in their endeavor because it's concerning to me to make a line of thought somehow magically dangerous. Do you know what I mean?
Right. It seems to me that like they end up using all of these tactics that they accuse the objects of their criticism of using, like approaching things in the most cynical way possible.
It's funny though because like when I read it, I think I understand what they're talking about, and I don't think they're actually talking about what they claim to be talking about. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, I think that's the point. Is that like the people who already agree to a large extent with the conclusion of the book in a basic sense that like there is a problem with the universities and that what they're teaching is often nonsense and that this informs scholarship or this informs like weaker scholarship that informs activism or whatever. People who agree with that can read through this, not check the endnotes and think, you know, largely, yeah, this sounds right? But to someone who is a little bit skeptical of the conclusion, or at least of the genealogy and the right, like I don't think that there's no problems in the universities, and that at least, I mean, I'm fine with admitting that at least some of the activism we see is informed by scholarship which is like questionable in its basis.
I mean, Evergreen
like,
is an easy thing to point to.
Yeah, right. Like Evergreen happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a problem there. Like evergreen, like I don't want evergreen happening anywhere else.
Me neither.
But but still, right? Like they're making this really ambitious argument, and it seems to me that like each of these chapters to actually convince someone who's skeptical would need like its own book.
Yeah, it's actually because of my more religious background, I think I find it easier to empathize with your argument, because I immediately put myself in the position of somebody who's being attacked for a belief or a way of looking at things that's useful to them, a lens. And theology is a lot closer to philosophy than it is close to science. I think that they could have made a strong, like, had they, maybe there are instances where science departments are being influenced by this line of thinking, in which case I think it would be like very relevant to attack that, to say like, this, I will say, none of this belongs in a science classroom. That doesn't mean it doesn't belong in a classroom. It just doesn't belong in a science classroom. I find that frustrating about James Lindsay myself. I don't know about Helen Pluckrose, but about James Lindsay myself, he's a little bit too much where he thinks that the academy should be science.
Yeah. Yeah, Pluckrose probably less so because she like pursued a degree in literature. So yeah, probably less so there. She just wants this stuff sort of out of it. But yeah, so then they go, so I brought up this like, to me, completely ridiculous description of queer theory where all categorization is oppressive, and then they say because of this, queer theory is notoriously difficult to define, perhaps partly because being comprehensible would be inconsistent with queer theory's radical distrust of language and would violate its ambition to avoid all categorization. I mean, oh my God. Do they think that queer theorists just don't know what language is? Like that they don't know that using language requires saying that like when you use a word, I mean, it's just ridiculous. Who do they think these people are?
Well, okay, I'm going to push back a little, but again, it's not on what you're saying. So I had a friend who was a sociology PhD in my area, and we're not friends anymore. But when we were, she would get really into, she was like, it's not my area, but she'd get really into like queer theory and then really into post-colonial theory, you know, and I remember having conversations with her where what they're saying was very close to what she was saying. And I mean, that's bad for the theories themselves if it's inaccurate. So
if it's true that they're saying these things that your friend says that they're saying, then they should cite it and show us where it is, right?
I get it. But that's why I bring up that the classroom is a different place than a publication. It's a lot easier, I think. It's a lot.
But to go back to gender, does it like queer theory have a difficult time, like, you know, defining exactly what you know, what is a male and what is a female?
This is what I was going to say.
Like,
so, yeah, so they might reject a definition of those things, right? But they say that they reject all categorization, including of itself, so that queer theory can't actually even define itself, which would be like a pretty serious problem. They say that, and then they go on to say that the next paragraph, because the central feature of queer theory is that it resists categorization and distrusts language, it's generally difficult to work with. Queer theory is not only resistant to definition in the usual sense, but also functional definitions based on what it does. Papers that use queer theory usually begin by examining an idea, problematizing it in queer or queering or gender fucking ways, and eventually concluding that there can be no conclusions. Okay, if papers that use queer theory usually begin with examination and end by concluding that there can be no conclusions, please just give me one example.
No, I was thinking that when I read that. I was thinking it's exactly what Sam's gonna say, and it's a valid criticism. No,
and then no, right here, right? This is to me like the most frustrating part, is that they've been talking about how queer theory does not ever define itself for like 2 pages now, And then they say, as Anne-Marie Jagos, the author of Queer Theory, puts it, it's not simply that queer has yet to solidify and take on a more consistent profile, but rather that its definitional indeterminacy, its elasticity, is one of its constituent characteristics. And that's she says that on the first page. And then they say the incoherence of queer theory is an intentional feature, not a bug. But when you go to the end note where they actually cite Anne-Marie Jagos saying that sort of thing, then they say that Jagos actually defines queer theory. And they give like a whole paragraph where she's defining queer theory, and it's a pretty reasonable definition. She says that queer theory, or broadly speaking, queer describes those gestures or analytical models which dramatize incoherencies in the allegedly stable relations between chromosomal sex, gender, and sexual desire, right? Resisting that model of stability, queer focuses on mismatches between sex, gender, and desire. That, to me, seems like an elegant and simple definition of queer theory. And I wonder, why do they cite that in the end notes rather than in the body of their text, where they argue that queer theory could not be defined?
Well, okay. I want to ask a question. Could you explain gender fucking then? Because that, to me, seems clearly like, is that actually a term used in queer theory?
That's a term that's used. Yeah.
Because that seems...
I don't know whether it's used in the scholarship itself. I mean, let's see what the citation they give is. It's endnote number 9. But I mean, I think it's based on the ideas. No, okay. So rather than giving us a citation of the term gender fucking in the endnote, they say, the authors hasten to note that gender fucking is a technical academic term in queer theory, which means roughly to fuck about with the meaning of gender so as to queer it. That's in quotes, and there's no citation. So if it's an academic term, give me an example of an academic paper using it.
But what if the academics
easy
themselves...
to see where it comes from.
What if the academics themselves are using that term and not putting it in their papers, but using it to describe what they're attempting to do with their papers?
That's a possibility. They could like find an article about that talks about that, or they could find like a YouTube video where academics do that. I think it's easy to see where it comes from, though. It comes from, I think, Judith Butler's
I don't like
sort
Judith
of proposed
Butler.
solution. That's fine. Judith Butler's supposed solution to the problem of gender being sort of just performance-based. The solution to it, so like if it's a problem that we're sort of slotted into these roles and that we sort of just perform them, most of us without even thinking about the fact that we're performing them, we just sort of uncritically think that we are a man or a woman or something like that. What's the solution to undermining these rigid categories is to it's like this politics of parody idea, right? Which I guess I'm performing right now. Like I just did like a feminine gesture with my hair. I have long hair, and that's like a feminine thing or something. So I guess I'm gender fucking in that way. Or to be like my girlfriend is a woman, right, with a shaved head. Like that's a gender fucking idea.
I get it.
Seems like it's a fair way to think about it.
It's a fair way to think about it for individuals. It's not a fair way to think about it if the attempt is to influence.
Well, I think actually to influence, right? To if like people in like prominent roles in society, right? Say like you're a little girl and all your favorite singers growing up have long hair, but then there's this like new singer who breaks onto the scene and she's a woman and she has a shaved head, right? Like unless you see someone of some prominence in society that is gender fucking in this kind of way, then you might never know that it's even like an option.
Okay. I'm putting this up. Can you see?
What does it say? I can't see it. What does it say?
Your mane is so manly, though.
Is it manly? What's manly about it? Is it because I have a beard?
It's because you're a man.
Then it might be that. Bye. Okay. Bye. Happy Rosh Hashanah to everyone. I'm not celebrating with the family because it's more important.
My friend
to
who
talk
is
about
a
queer
Shabbat
theory.
shalom.
my Catholic priest friend sent me a Rosh Hashanah card in the mail. He always says that. He sends me because he knows that I like all religions, so he sends me something from everything. I appreciate it.
All religions, but what about social justice, the religion?
Well, we're not going to go into that right now. We do need to schedule at some
Yeah.
point that time to do that. But yeah.
Well, James Lindsay has apparently put out like a half book length essay on how social justice is a religion on his new discourses blog.
Did you see the latest Sam Harris episode with McWhorter, where the title is
McWhorter, yeah.
The New Religion of
If
Anti-Racism?
anyone's gonna make a convincing case, I think it'll be McWhorter. James Lindsay, good luck.
I think
I haven't seen it yet.
He makes a good point. He makes a good case. He's saying the things that I try to say and fail to. Like I'm not good at it.
Because he's a serious academic.
And he's a linguist, so
James
like
Lindsay, on the
using
other hand.
language to communicate an idea is, if he couldn't do that, he'd be really shit at his job.
So yeah, okay. Then they say, let's see, where do we go next? Yeah. So then we get discussion of biology in queer theory on page 96. The middle paragraph, they say, as a result, they say, because queer theory is thoroughly postmodern, it is radically socially constructivist. As a result, if biology makes an appearance in queer theoretical scholarship, it's usually for one of two purposes: to problematize it as merely one way of knowing, or to demonstrate something that no one denies, that intersex people exist. The existence of intersex people is pointed out only to obfuscate the facts that an overwhelming proportion of Homo sapiens are either male or female sexed, and that gender expression in humans is overwhelmingly bimodal in nature and strongly correlated with sex. Okay, like, citation, right? Any examples? No? Okay. We
Like,
continue.
Is it, like, people that are actually have like more than one sex organ, that's like really, really rare.
Yeah, and nobody denies that it's rare.
My sociologist friend absolutely denied that it was rare. She said, she used the number and she said that's not rare. And I was like, okay, well, I disagree.
Like I know, like, you can't cite Wikipedia, but Wikipedia was like 1 every 10,000. Like, it's like crazy rare.
It's very rare.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, seems rare to me. I've never heard anyone say it wasn't rare. And I mean, your example, I'm not denying, Jimmy, that she said it wasn't rare. I just think that she was wrong.
Well, it being rare does matter, though, right? Because five-fingered gloves are not there's no problem with five-fingered gloves that's the default just because there's people with 6 fingers.
Right. No, I don't. I agree, but I just wanted an example of the kind of use of biology in queer theory that they're claiming is the only way that biology ever shows up. So, like, that might be true, but it would be a hard thing to prove. And so maybe that's why they don't give any citations. So, let's see. We're on, yes. So then they give footnote 13. They say that knowledge about biology and psychology and how sexuality works is not welcome in queer theory. On the contrary, it's generally regarded with the utmost suspicion as an inherently dangerous or even violent way to categorize and constrain those who do not fit neatly into one of the following categories: masculine man attracted to women and feminine woman attracted to men. The footnote is, some trans scholars and activists have recently begun to call upon science, as neuroscience has increasingly provided evidence that trans people's experience of their gender as different from their sex is biologically based. This has not made significant inroads into queer theory. Well, if the neuroscience is so clear, why don't you give us some examples of it and some examples of trans scholars calling upon it? But no, that's ultimately irrelevant, it seems. Then, let's see, what's next? We talk about biopower. This is on page 97. They say biopower is how the biological sciences legitimize the knowledge that the powerful use to maintain their dominance. They say that scientists began to study and categorize sexuality, Foucault claims they simultaneously constructed sexuality and created the sexual identities and categories that accompany these constructions. Then they give a quote from Foucault that I don't think actually says what they just said. And again, from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Foucault, we get the claim that Foucault does not claim that sex, understood as the categories of maleness and femaleness, was invented in a particular historical period. He rather analyzes the ways in which these categories were founded and explained in discourses claiming the status of scientific truth, and how these allegedly pure explanation in fact constituted these categories so that they were understood as natural. This, honestly, I don't want to get into a dispute about what Foucault did or didn't say, because that took up a lot of our time in the first episode.
Yeah, I'm keeping
but just
my
to
mouth
bring
shut.
it up as a contrary perspective that someone might argue in defense of what Foucault was saying.
I took many notes.
And then again, right? So continuing more on Foucault, on the same page toward the bottom, they say, for Foucault, power operated more like a grid. This is in contrast to the Marxist conception of power, which is top-down. They say for Foucault, power operates like a grid running through all layers of society and determining what people held to be true, and consequently how they spoke about it. This is, again, intimately related to this kind of vacillation that I talked about on the postmodern political principle.
Okay,
because
so
if it's based on Foucault, then it's not this top-down, unjust conception of power that organizes society. Rather, it's this more all-permeating grid or web of power that everyone is constantly enforcing and reinforcing, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, and I'm not going to get into an argument. To me, anti-culture necessitates counterculture, but I get what you're saying. You can't really lay that at the feet of Foucault.
Well, even, right, no, I'm just talking about the conception of power, though, because at the beginning, they discussed the postmodern political principle as one of unjust political power, which sounds like the Marxist one, even though Marx himself claimed that actually under capitalism is just. But let's not get into the weeds of that.
Yeah. I'm actually more interested in the next page, in the fairy godmother of queer theory.
Is that wait? Is this 99? Yeah.
Yes. Because I felt like the citations here were pretty damning.
Really? Okay. So let's start. 99. Finally, we get some actual citations of queer theorists and the origins of queer theory. We're only, what, 10 pages in?
I took no notes before this, just so you know. I agree with you. I was like, there's nothing to say here because...
Yeah. So, okay. So here we go. This is, I think, an important one. So they're talking about Gail Rubin in a 1984 essay. They say that her essay... okay, so first let's just say here's the excerpt they give. Rubin says, "It is impossible to think with any clarity about the politics of race or gender as long as these are thought of as biological entities rather than as social constructs. Similarly, sexuality is impervious to political analysis as long as it is primarily conceived as a biological phenomenon or an aspect of individual psychology." Now, so clearly, Rubin is making an analogy between gender and race on the one hand and sexuality on the other, and claiming that these are all socially constructed. But the analysis that Pluckrose and Lindsay give is that this is agenda-driven, that Rubin asserts that we should believe sex, gender, and sexuality are social constructs, not because it's necessarily true, but because it is easier to politicize them and demand change if they are social constructs than if they are biological. Now, let's see if the analogy works. Is she claiming that we should think of gender and race as social constructs because it's easier to do politics the way we want to if they are? I think what a more plausible interpretation that seems obvious to me is that, look, she thinks race and gender are socially constructed for independent reasons, right? Because the evidence shows that, like, we made up this concept of race in order to justify slavery and colonialism, and that, you know, our concept of gender is parochial and that it doesn't actually, universalize the way that we used to think it did, and so we should see them as socially constructed. And she also has some reasons for thinking that sexuality functions this way, probably because she read Foucault, right? And she thinks Foucault has shown that sexuality too is a social construct. She's not saying we should think sexuality is a social construct because it makes politics easier. I think it's clear that what she's saying is we should think sexuality is a social construct because of the history. And if we're trying to think clearly about the politics of sexuality, then we need to acknowledge this.
All right, it's unfair mind reading by Lindsay to guess why saying it and not just respond to the argument.
Well, what about the pedophilia claim?
Well, yeah, I think that's clearly a problem. Yeah, like
That-
she does seem to appear to defend pedophilia as a sort of one sexuality among others.
Don't you
And that,
have to?
like,
Don't you have to, based on that way of looking at sexuality?
Do you have to? I don't know.
How do you avoid it? With this framework of looking at sexuality, how do you avoid it?
I mean,
I don't.
you can
I
say
mean,
that,
I don't
right? For
disagree
instance,
that like pedophilia is a perversion, but that should be illegal. But I don't think like there's probably a genetic component to it. So, like, I don't really disagree with the argument that, like, I mean,
Well,
she's
she's-
saying it's not necessarily wrong,
But
It's
she's
not
saying
necessarily
it's
wrong
not.
for the
It's not
person-
genetic.
It's not necessarily the wrong for the person that's attracted to child. I mean, maybe they can't help it, but it's wrong for them to act on it because they're hurting the child. So,
yeah, I mean, that's one thing she
kind
can
of-
say.
It's not what she, I mean. For me,
It's not clear what she actually thinks.
True, but I don't see how you could, using this framework, how you could exclude that perspective. How you could say that's too far.
How you could say what? I mean, well, you can't say that it's like natural or unnatural because the claim is that these things aren't natural, right?
No,
So,
but how you could say that means that is an unacceptable sexuality.
Well, I mean, what you're probably going to be forced to say is that, look, it's not an unacceptable orientation, but it's something that acting on would be immoral to do because of either the harm it would cause to the child or
Yeah, but I mean, even that's
the-
kind of what's happening. I mean, and I don't like that. I don't think we should consider it
What do you mean?
I mean, there's whole groups of people online who, I forget what the name they use to describe themselves, but the idea is they're
attracted to children.
They're attracted to children, and they talk openly about it because it's acceptable, and they say that prevents them from doing it. And I would like, my argument
I mean,
is,
if that's true,
But Jimmy,
right? If that's true that it
alright,
does
if-
prevent them from doing it, I mean, then maybe we should accept it, right? Because if we can end, like,
well, that's no,
like-
because what if child porn prevents them from doing it?
well, that's a different hypothetical, right? I'm saying
Yeah,
if
child porn. I mean, yeah.
that's a different
But, Jimmy, if
hypothetical.
someone's like attracted to children and they can't help it because it's their genetic disposition. What should we do? Just murder them?
We shouldn't say that
Or
it's
jail them
it's an
for life?
acceptable sexuality. I mean, what if people are born to kill people? We would never say it's acceptable to think that it's a good idea to kill people. I mean, you would never respond to people that
But-
way.
If, let's say, in a world where people are born to kill people, but if they could form support groups where instead of ever killing people, they just talked with other people who are similarly motivated, and that prevented them from ever acting on it, I don't see why that wouldn't be like the best possible solution.
Just talking about it.
Well, that seems to be the thing you're describing, where there's these communities, and they claim that actually talking about it openly with other people
Yeah, but they
prevents
did,
them from
but like,
having the urge to actually do it.
yeah, but I don't think that's okay. I think you can't normalize that sort of, just because it's something that you feel like you can't help doesn't make it an okay thing to think about. It doesn't. It just doesn't. It's not okay. You should be in
So,
therapy,
but I mean, are we
or
gonna
like,
have thought crimes?
no, I'm just saying culturally, like, the proper response to that would be like, that is an unhealthy, incorrect way of feeling the feeling of desire, and you should not feel like that's okay. You should never feel like that's
Right,
okay.
but just telling them that is not obviously gonna make anything better.
Agreed.
So if it turns out that the only way to make things better is for them to be honest and openly discuss these desires, then maybe that's how we ought to address it. I just don't know enough about this subject to have a strong opinion on it. But like, it seems to me that in the world where that is how things work, that would be a totally fair way to try to address the problem.
So what if it was the only way? So like, a lot of these communities talk openly about actual children, that, you know, like child stars, and like they're talking about an actual person. Is that too far?
Again, like,
Maybe.
it depends on the way that the way that talking openly about kids in general, or a particular kid, is related to preventing them from actually acting on it. Like this, I think this is getting a little far from the actual content of queer theory.
Yeah, fair. It's just like that sort of is, to me, a smoking gun, at least, about a problem of it going too far.
But would it be a problem of
Well, I
queer
mean-
theory, or would it be a problem of that particular author?
Well, if the field is
nobody
considering
else-
it acceptable, I'd say the field. It's at least a problem with the field in terms of not
But
being able
admittedly,
to.
we've gone way beyond what she actually writes. So we don't like.
Okay,
But
fair.
I think for like actual like liberals, I think like it's a hard topic too. So it's not
Yeah, it's
just
a
a hard
serious problem,
topic
yeah.
for, you know, postmodern, you know, cynical theory people. It's just a hard topic for everyone. Like, what do you do if someone's attracted to children? I mean, ugh, you know.
I mean, you could
Alright,
say the same thing about you know, sexual assailants, people who, like, everybody I know who's actually been a victim of sexual assault says you can't help those people. They should be locked away for life. I don't know that
Yeah, I mean, if they actually commit a crime. But I mean, some people.
no.
like, you could
They're
argue
saying
that-
they're saying like there's something that they'll never be able to stop with that sort of.
Well, I mean, some people do have like perversion that they want to, like, you know, they want a woman to be like hurt when they're, you know, they want to, that's what turns them on. So, and maybe that's also genetic, that they have that perversion.
Yeah,
I think we're getting
really
astray.
far away. We are, when we're too far into this to do this. So I think we should probably quickly summarize the rest of this chapter. I think it's pretty similar to what we talked about. Don't you?
But I just want to point out that, like, none of this stuff where they actually bring up the quotes from Sedgwick and from Butler, I think actually show them making the sorts of claims that they've been making for the first, like, 10 pages where they're summarizing queer theory. Like, it seems to me that in what they're doing in this chapter is the first, all these claims that I said, citation needed, citation needed, citation needed, these are things that they get from, like, looking at, like, 14-year-old queer theory activists on Tumblr, and then they're trying to sort of fit them in with these things that Butler and
can you restart your camera
Sedgwick
again?
and
Sorry,
Rubin. Yeah. No problem.
No, I don't disagree with it's hard because it's like, I don't think most people are reading this the way that you, and arguably the way that they wrote it. Because
isn't that a problem, right? Because
I maybe, but like all of my notes are not about whether these people actually said this or not. They're about, like, they're about the theory itself and the sorts of questions that are opened up by this perspective.
But the way that they're painting the theory,
I
they don't have a lot of evidence for it, right?
I-
Like they have some evidence for some of the parts of the theory.
Yeah, your camera's not coming back up, just so you know. You might want to turn it off and turn it back on. No, I understand, but I do think that for most people who have no idea what these theories are, it does open a door to saying, wow, this is something that is acceptable to even, this is something that's being taught in schools. Yeah, your camera's not working, but that's okay. It's no big deal.
Yeah, guess not.
Yeah, just turn it off, and I'll just put your profile picture on. No big deal.
Okay. Maybe it'll come back at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so on page 102, they say that. So I mean, I'll also like say I think Judith Butler's theory of gender as performative is like the best account of gender as separate from sex that I've seen, right? Because the alternatives are something like gender, like what your gender is what you sincerely identify with, but I don't really know what sincerely identifying with a gender means. Like, do I really like feel like a man or something like that? Like, I just don't know what that means. And so to say that like my gender identity is constituted by my sort of habits, and how the way that I carry myself in the world and how my social environment perceives those as gendered one way or another, that is sort of how we make sense of what my gender is. I think that like makes a lot of sense to me. And they say on page 102 that only by taking up these roles, for Butler, only by taking up these roles and performing them according to those social expectations, people create the oppressive illusion that the roles themselves are real, stable, and inherently meaningful. I mean, I don't see any evidence of Butler saying that they're oppressive. Maybe she does think that they're oppressive. I'd just like to see like a quote or something. And what does she mean by oppressive? If what she means is just that they sort of put us into these boxes of having to feel pressured to perform a certain way, then I think that's true, right? I mean, it's clear to me that like when I was a kid in middle school or something, and me hanging out with all my friends who were guys, right, and them being so afraid to like you know, people say no homo and shit like that. Like, why do we say that? It's because we feel pressured not to be homosexual. Like, it seems obvious to me that that's true. So if that's what she means by oppressive, then yeah.
I mean, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm not gay, so I don't know. But I feel like everybody's pressured to not feel what they feel when they're young. I don't think homosexuals are excused from that, but I mean, historically, obviously, they were more so.
But like, with respect to how we feel pressured to live up to certain gender and sexual expectations, I think that's like one of the clearest examples, at least in our childhood.
Yeah, I guess like it depends really, because that no homo thing, I knew a lot of gay people and they didn't care. I guess they thought it was kind of funny. It was a sort of,
which no, it doesn't have to be like that it's wrong to say no homo. The question is just, why do people say it in the first place?
Okay.
It seems to signal that
I think
they are,
it makes fun of the
gay
fact
when something.
I don't know. I think it teases the idea of masculinity being attached to ability to score with women. I think it's just
sure, but take a much more expansive example, like when kids use the word gay in a negative way, right? Oh, you know, Mr. Jenkins assigned us like 12 pages of homework, dude. That's so gay, right? That just means like fuck that,
yeah,
right? And it's a sort of way of distancing yourself from homosexuality, to affirm what you are by denying what you're not.
I hear what you're saying. It's just, and I all I have are my own anecdotes, but like, I don't know. It was extra funny when an actual gay person said that. Like when an actual gay person
Right,
said
but
that, it's like hilarious.
It's clearly as a joke then, right? They're clearly saying it in jest.
Yeah.
But the original phenomenon is much more serious, I think.
But my point is that the existence of that language itself does not mean that it's a problem right now. It clearly means that I mean, it came from. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you like that it came from a different idea, I guess.
See if my camera works. Probably not.
You can leave that.
No, it's not working.
Buzzy things. No, I get you.
Let's see.
Let's move on though.
The last thing I had that was like real on this one. So their discussion of Sedgwick on pages 105 and 106. They say, let's see. They say that for Sedgwick, this is bottom of page 105 before they quote an excerpt from her book. For Sedgwick, sexual binaries underlie all social binaries, and that the epistemology of the closet spells this out. So the quote says, the book will argue that an understanding of virtually any aspect of modern Western culture must be not merely incomplete, but damaged in its central substance to the degree that it does not incorporate a critical analysis of modern homo or heterosexual definition. So to interpret this as saying that sexual binaries underlie all social binaries is to me clearly a stretch. It seems to me that what she's saying is if you want to understand modern Western culture, you're going to have to include how things are linked to the expectations of heterosexuality and homosexuality as a sort of deviance. But to say that that underlies all social binaries is a clearly different claim.
I feel nervous to express my actual thoughts about this because I'm afraid it will be seen as homophobic. But like,
I am the arbiter of all homophobia, so we'll find out.
Not just you, but so like, I actually wrote this down as pluralism versus plurality. For me, pluralism is two villages. I can't read my own writing. With distinct centers that interact with each other at the margins. Plurality is no villages, all margin, therefore no margin. So like for me, homosexuality is in the margins. It's not a normal thing. It's not, but that doesn't mean anything about it being good or bad. But it's not something that is the concept of queer to me is the stuff that is, like you said, it is the stuff that isn't normal. It's specifically the stuff that isn't normal. I think that to make that normative almost destroys a little bit about what makes it interesting and useful to society.
To make what normative? I mean,
the queer
they're not
things.
Claiming that like it's norm. They don't claim that it's like normal to be queer, or that like as a matter of fact, it's not the case that most people identify with heterosexuality. I don't think they claim that at all. I think they're just saying so. Like, there's two ways you could interpret normal. There's normal according to like the distribution, and then there's normal as in like in line with what is ordinary or accepted in society. And they want to attack the latter, I think.
I think I understand. I guess
like
I hate. I don't want to use the analogy that is in my head because I'm afraid.
But even like just real quick before we go on, because I don't think what you were saying in that example was necessarily related to the point that I was trying to make. The point that I was just trying to make is that, look, there's a difference between saying that the connection between most aspects of modern Western culture and whether one is homosexual or heterosexual is important, and then the claim that the binary of sexuality forms the basis of all binary thinking. Like, do you think that the quote they give from Sedgwick actually supports the claim that she thinks all social binary thinking is predicated on the binary between homosexual and heterosexual?
No.
Does anyone in here?
Say that again.
The quote they give at the bottom of page 105
He
from
doesn't have the
Sedgwick.
read book, so he doesn't have the book. So I'll read it.
Oh, okay.
The book will argue that an understanding of virtually any aspect of modern Western culture must be not merely incomplete, but damaged in its central substance to the degree that it does not incorporate a critical analysis of modern homo/heterosexual definition. Oh, Sam got kicked.
I came back on purpose to see if my camera could work this time.
It's
Nope,
okay if not.
still fucked.
It's no big deal.
Chris, what do you think, though?
I don't quite understand what they're saying. I wish I had it in front of me, but it's
Yeah,
like
that's
so
fair.
there's like some confusion about like the definitions of like heterosexual and homosexual.
No, not necessarily. What they're saying, they just give this quote from a queer theorist who I interpret to be saying that the binary between homosexual and heterosexual pervades a lot of modern Western culture and sort of cultural norms, that it's present, like expectations surrounding the like heteronormativity are present in a lot of aspects of modern Western culture. And what they claim her to be saying is actually that the binary between heterosexuality and homosexuality underlies all social binaristic thinking, so that any binaries in our social ontology owe their existence to the binary of homosexuality, heterosexuality.
Well, in terms of sexuality, I think they're at least close to claiming that, right? Sorry, Chris.
No, I mean I don't really think I'm gonna be able to add much. But it was kind of like a confusing phrase. I don't know. I don't think it was that straightforward.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, even if like you take Sam's point, it kind of depends. Like, you know, where do you get your like social pressures from? You know, like I sat down at a table today with like a bunch of progressives, and it's like they were clearly talking about like some stuff they've been reading off of like Huffington Post for like years. So it's like, I mean, I haven't read Huffington Post in years, so it's like what their world is and what they think is, you know, I mean, they were even talking about like, what the hell was it? Like internalized misogyny. Like I've never even heard of that, but like, you know, it's stuff like this that like they're gonna hear about. They're gonna have different opinions on. It depends on like your view, but.
Well, Sam, what do you think about what I just said? That in terms of sexuality, I think they're saying that. If we're talking about sexuality, they're saying
Sure,
that.
but that's a very plausible claim. But what Lindsay and Pluckrose say is that all social binaries, right? So like white and non-white, like I mean, what else? Man and woman, and I mean all sorts of Democrat, Republican, you know, like smart and stupid, like all sorts of things.
I guess I didn't think
atheist.
I didn't think that they were talking.
All right, do they think atheists are homosexual? Like,
no, but I think it was clear they meant in terms of sexuality that everything about.
I don't think so. No, they clear to be they seem to know that they're attributing to Sedgwick a very radical claim, right? For Sedgwick, sexual binaries underlie all social binaries. For Sedgwick, then, a binary understanding of sexuality forms the basis on which all binary thinking rests. Like,
maybe.
Yeah, I mean, and then blah blah blah. Sedgwick is rejecting objective truth. And then, yeah, more about how queer theory differs fundamentally from liberal feminism because universal liberal approaches were very successful, and liberal activism that came before theory focused on changing prejudiced attitudes towards people of a certain sex, gender, sexuality, and it sort of is behind all of the progress, and queer theory has done nothing. And
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, yeah.
Let's not get into the conclusion. We all know what you're going to say about it. The title
Anyways,
is the postmodern
I guess we have to
principles.
talk about critical race theory now.
I don't think this is gonna. I think you're gonna. I don't think you're gonna. I don't know. Maybe I'm.
I have a lot less to say about that chapter.
Yes. Based on our other conversations, that doesn't surprise me. I was kind of surprised when you said the opposite. I don't like critical race theory.
I feel like this has really largely been like this doesn't seem like a book club. It seems like a sort of me standing on top of a podium.
Well, the thing is, it's because I think different people are going to read this book in different ways. You're reading it as this book is its goal, and I get it. They're pretty explicit about it. Is its function is in outing the academics behind these specific fields in philosophy. But I think most people will read this and think this is about this is about things being taught in school that seem really foreign to the average person and seem somewhat of a problem in terms of ways to think about problems in society.
Okay. Could you say that again?
I think
they're thinking about it how?
So I think like in terms of wow, they're teaching this kind of stuff in college. That seems like not a good idea. I don't like this.
Right. Okay. But don't you like it makes sense to you, right? That if that's what they're really trying to say, or if that's how people are going to read it, then to give an accurate representation of what's actually being taught.
I think it would have been better to just.
I don't think it's.
I think it would have been better to just be descriptive.
Well, Jimmy, are you convinced? Like we've heard Sam, for 3 different things. Are you convinced that Lindsay and Pluckrose really gave a very description of what's going on?
The thing is, all of my arguments are against the theories, not against the claims being made about the theories. Does that make sense? So I
didn't follow. But
I think these disciplines are very wrong about the things that they're claiming. But like that's not the way that Sam is taking this book. Sam is taking this book in terms of they're making claims about theories and not substantiating them.
Right. Well, I mean, if you want to argue against the theory based on how they've described the theory, they need to describe the theory accurately for your arguments to actually go through.
Well, I guess again, then I go back to this is where we get into the weeds, because my idea of definition of words and yours are not the same, and I really think that most people, without thinking about it, think more the way that I do.
So if so, then there's a central problem with the book, because they're either lying about what they're doing when they say that, look, we are going to explain to you these origins of these ideas from the scholarship itself, or most people who are interpreting their book are misinterpreting their book because they take them to be describing sort of the problems generally with these things rather than their origins in the scholarship themselves.
It just it doesn't. It's almost like two books, like because there's one book that I'm like, I generally agree with these things they're saying, but they're really about an essence, a feeling coming from the academy, and I agree with them about it. But then when they actually go into attacking the theories themselves, or attacking the academics themselves or the things they're saying, they're not going to be able to accomplish their goal there.
Right. So they should have written a different book.
Well, can I go for a second? Like, if you read Nietzsche is all like, all right, I'm right. Here's my argument, and it's it's a bunch of it's all about his argument. It's very Nietzsche's pretty focused on subject he's talking about, and it's all about that. He's not writing for like the layman. Helen and Lindsay were writing for like the layman, so they're explaining, hey, here's the there's a guy named Michel Foucault. He was, he did this, and this. So they're kind of like, ready like on that level and explaining stuff.
But to Sam's point though, they're making claims about things that have been said that they could substantiate but are not, that they could provide evidence for but are not.
They could, but sometimes they do have, like they do have some citations in the book.
Yeah, no,
it's just that when we get to them, Sam thinks they're inadequate.
Well, no, not just that, like, that some of them are inaccurate, but also that, like, in very many places where citations are needed, there are none.
Yeah, but that actually is the more interesting part of the book to me.
I actually think you've definitely substantiated that claim too. I didn't necessarily notice that, and you've definitely proven that a lot of like this chapter you just went over, like Lindsay gets on his like high horse about he kind of paints them first, and what he should do, like in some of the other chapters they do, is he should quote them first and then have his analysis at the end of the chapter. It seems like it makes more sense to do that. By painting them first, he kind of like poisons the well.
How about for this chapter we do it a different way? So I've taken some notes on this, but like I think Sam, you're gonna find if we did this on other chapters, you'd be like, well, yeah, I guess, but that has nothing to do with the book, because you're reading it differently. I do. Your critiques are accurate. I mean, I don't know what to say. Like they're it's easy to poke holes in it, because if they had just stuck with the stuff that they could provide evidence for, it would have been a more interesting book. And if they had made it clear, like, this is what we like, when they go into the spots where there are long like paragraphs without a citation, if instead they said this has been our experience on campus, I feel like that would be interesting. Because it's more about campus atmosphere and culture, and which I think is accurate in my experience. Harder to provide evidence for, but clearly made in a way that isn't an objective claim.
If this book were about Evergreen and Robin DiAngelo, then cool. But there's like one chapter where that's what the book is about.
Which chapter?
Chapter 9. And they talk about DiAngelo. I mean, my critique of chapter 8 was basically like, if they were just talking about Robin DiAngelo, this chapter would be cool. But they're attributing it to a bunch of rigorous philosophers who I think they clearly haven't understood.
So here, on page 116, they quote Bell.
Derek Bell.
Yes. Yeah. And so I'm curious, did you have a problem with that section? Because I made a note about what he said. He said black people will never gain full equality in this country. And I wrote a note about that because I find that to be a very bad way to look at things. I said, by declaring this, Bell ensures power imbalance remains. Solutions must come from white masters. The only alternative Bell leaves open is to abandon America. Because...
Yeah. No, I think Derek Bell's approach, like, it's a very rhetorically appealing approach, but you can't make an argument for the claim that X will never happen.
Yes. Right. I just I read that and I was like, nope, not okay. You can't say that.
I mean, I understand why someone might think that, but I think that it's like that the evidence supports that view. Well, no, because the evidence could never really support a view of the type.
I think more
this kind of society is impossible in principle.
I think
right? Like
I'm more concerned about what that means if true. If that's true, then forever whites are the master class that must have an obligation to help out the blacks, and the only way out of that is to leave them, is that America has to be brought down.
Right, it's creating like ethno states.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think Derek Bell, I'm sure he had a lot of great scholarship throughout his career, right? But the idea that racism is permanent and will never be solved at all is kind of like the claim that like we're living in a simulation. Like if it's true, it's not at all helpful.
If it's true, it would mean, I mean, to make that claim, if anybody believes you, the first thing they should do is go buy as many guns as they can if they're black. You know, like that's the first thing they should do. If you actually believe that's true.
It's going to depend on how we define racism, right? And that's one of the crucial things here, is that a lot of the time critical race theorists don't have the same definition of racism.
Yeah, that's so irritating to me. You know this. I've had this discussion with you. It's so irritating to me. Because I find it extremely, I can't help feeling like that's on purpose. That's on purpose. They're using a word that they know that this country has a correct, viscerally negative response to because of our history.
Was that the case when Derek Bell was writing in the 70s? I don't know. It's definitely not obvious to me. Like nowadays, we have visceral reactions to being called racist. It's like people often joke, right? Racist is the N-word for white people. It's the most offensive thing you can call them. And was that true in the 70s? I think probably not, right? Like I think people would have been more okay with being called racists back then. It would have definitely compared to now.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. I don't know. I just.
I would say no, but.
But if that's the case, then then I go back. If that's the case, then the racism that Bell is talking about here is the one I'm talking about.
Well, I mean, the one you're talking about is like attitudes of superiority from individuals. When I don't think that's necessarily the exact same thing. I think he has that in mind, like that's included within racism, but this was right around the time of the popularization of the term institutionalized racism, where the idea is that racism and seriously unjust racial disparities can persist even if there are no individual racists.
Yeah, I find that definition to be just nothing but a problem. It's unuseful.
And that I got you, like that is a view. It's not a common view in the academy, so we can understand why there isn't a lot of pushback from academics on that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, what do I think about their chapter on critical race theory? Well, so page 113, they say that they're talking about the sort of invention of the concept of race. And they say that basically the the constructed ideas of race were specifically used to justify the atrocities of European colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade. I think that's true. And they're saying this was done by emerging forms of scholarship in what we would now call the social sciences and natural sciences, although they had neither separated clearly into the disciplines we would now call anthropology, sociology, and biology, nor formed what we would now consider rigorous methods. That's true. But then they say that, okay, so postmodernism rails against the legitimizing of science. Okay. Then they say they're talking about the origins of scientific racism, or often like pseudoscientific racism.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, this, we hear from theorists today, is the scientific origin of racism, which can be taken to mean that these discourses that misapplied very preliminary results from science allowed the first socially constructivist racists to come into existence. Socially constructivist racist sounds like racists who think race is a social construct, but the whole point of the scientific racism was that races are biological, and that this is biologically based inferiority or supremacy.
Yeah, that's why I actually wanted to push back on. I don't think. Well, the slave trade absolutely is what constructed race, right? In the way we look at it today.
Well, it wasn't like the slave trade that constructed race, but it was that race was
our
constructed in
current
order to
perspective
justify.
of race, our current ideas of race as being tied to skin color, let's say, came from
Right. Well, so the invention didn't come from the slave trade itself, right? From the transatlantic slave trade. That was invented in order to justify what would otherwise look like severely inhuman and anti-Christian and other just morally unacceptable practices.
I don't like the idea of invented. I would say I agree that
It was
colonialism. I don't know.
Then what else? What could it have been? If it's a social construct, it was constructed.
I think that it's the way I look at it is it's it's constructed. It's constructed, but I don't think it's so. Let's do you agree that we're innately tribal?
Sure.
So if you're a society that has figured out how to make ships and to go and weapons and to go across you're the first one to do it, and you go across the land and you're like, well, fuck it.
They weren't the first ones to do it, actually, but
okay, fair. The first ones to do it en masse. The first ones to be colonial about it.
Yeah, the first ones to use it to their advantage
Yes.
at the detriment of the colonized.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You're the first to do it.
Yeah.
Then you go to these countries. You go to these places you've never been. I don't think it would have mattered what color they were. If they were white, it still would have been exactly the same. It's still like, this is ours now.
Well, if so, then it couldn't, then race wouldn't have been invented.
No, I think it would have, because race used to refer to Italian people. So
does the word slave come from the Slavic people that were, enslaved at, at various times throughout history?
The
So there's
idea
a
of
history
so
of
that, so that,
slavery
but that's
between white people.
ethnicity, right? There's a difference between ethnic-based discrimination, which I think we can all agree has been around pretty much forever, right? Like the Greeks called non-Greeks barbarians, and this was taken to be evidence of their inferiority, right?
Yeah, but Italians were
race is the
considered a
first time
different
that it was
race.
done on the basis. So yes, right. At the beginning, Italians were racialized.
Yeah.
And
Right. So I don't really see a difference between that and othering Africans.
But I mean, okay, the concept
slave
of race
trade,
as it was
trans-
invented by the scientific racist was usually broken into 4 or 5 categories. You had the Caucasoids, or the whites, the Negroids, or the blacks, the Mongoloids, or the yellows, the Amerindians, or the reds, and sometimes there was one other one thrown in there, right? So Italians, in that one, Italians were categorized as white. It wasn't until the immigration of Italians into a very waspy society that Italians became racialized.
So that's kind of what I'm trying to say.
I also
That
think
like
we should.
race exists because of the need for an other, and for almost no other reason.
Right, to justify oppressing them.
Yeah, but my point is I don't sure, but you say when you say invented, I think most people would hear that and think some small group of people decided that we're going to decide to do this, rather than I think it's more likely that you come across another tribe that is different from you and that is in the way of what you want to do, and that's just the way that it's not natural to oh God, this is
Right, but this is the first time it was really systematized into like a worldwide theory of there being just
argument.
4 or 5 different ones. So that's what I'm saying is being invented.
I don't like the word invented.
Okay, created, constructed.
But can't you like
developed.
argue that there are like different populations of people that
Ethnicity.
have like very
That's
various
ethnicity is
features
like
that
a
are
scientifically
common?
respectable.
It's the same. It's the same as Christmas. It's the same as Christmas. Christmas wasn't invented, and I guess you could make an argument that it was.
Well, I mean,
it wasn't.
I mean,
though.
Christmas was for sure invented.
No,
How
it,
was it not invented?
All right.
it wasn't invented. It's a pagan holiday that became that evolved into it's a memeology.
Okay,
You
cool.
know, like it's a.
Cool.
Do you understand what I mean? The distinction I'm making?
Sure. The only reason I wanted to, I just wanted to push back on their representation of these scientific racists as constructivist racists. Like, these people were not racists. Like, they didn't think that race was constructed. They thought it was natural and biological and organized hierarchically, and they used that idea to justify what they were doing in their colonial practices.
Yeah, I would agree.
And with could we explain it one more time? I just didn't quite get it. And what do Lindsay and Helen think?
Oh, it's on 113.
No, but what do they think?
Well, they say so. I mean, they say that these
agree
things are
with this.
invented. They say
think it's
that
invented.
that race actually was invented.
Yeah. I do remember that.
But then they call it socially
it kind of
constructed.
reminds me of. I saw this guy being interviewed by Talibi. This is actually something that comes up a lot in Cynical Theories that we're talking about, because there's a lot of tension about this, and he thinks, the Martin Luther King theory that people shouldn't see race, and that
I think that was exactly Martin Luther King's theory, but
Right.
what he said was that was like the ideal end goal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I don't think anyone
So-
disagrees with that. But
And this,
I don't know. A
we
lot
should
of
just
seems
ignore
to be
it.
the seems
and
to
we
be.
and we should just ignore it. And then there's a lot of leftists think race is the most important thing, and then we need to
again,
have the right percentage of black people in college and the right percent of black people getting jobs at various fields.
They believe
they're
that is
very,
the way to get to what you're describing. I disagree with them, but
Right.
they believe.
So there's a lot of tension, and then there's some people that think we should just ignore it and act as though no one's racist. So there is actually a lot of tension in this issue.
yeah, that's true. And one thing I found interesting was on page, where is it? Was it 116? They acknowledge that actually, legal equality on paper is not sufficient to resolve all social inequalities. This is the second paragraph of 116. They say, of course, simple legal equality between races is not sufficient to resolve all social inequalities. There is valuable work in addressing measurable imbalances in the political, legal, and economic realms by comparing funding for schools in majority white and black areas, blah, 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 blah. This seems to me to amount to basically an admission that the colorblind theory of addressing racism is not sufficient as it stands. Because if you don't look at groups of people and acknowledge the ways that they've been racialized, then you won't see racial injustice. So my question when I saw this was like, oh my God, if this is true, then why do you embrace this colorblind approach to solving racism?
Right. If you never study by races, how do you know if people are being racist if you don't study it, right?
Right. Like in France, it's illegal to actually use race as a variable in statistics in the social sciences.
Interesting. I'm guessing you don't like that.
Well, I think that is basically only a reasonable way to look at society if there's no such thing as racial injustice in the society anymore. But
it's tough. This is a really
whether we've
difficult
reached that
issue
point.
because the question is how much of it helps you figure out the problems and how much of it perpetuates a problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a reasonable question to ask. And I don't think we have a clear answer to that at all.
Yeah, no. I was talking last night on Voice with some people, and here's an example of like why I am bothered by it. I had a situation at work where a woman who I work with, who, and I know this is like a problematic language, but happens to be black and happens to be terrible at her job. They're not connected. She just happens to be both of those things. There are lots of white people who happen to be very bad at their job where I work. I work for the state, so it's, the common thing. But so this particular woman is a problem for me because she comes to we work remotely now, but she would come to my desk once a week at minimum and ask the same question over and over and over again and never listen and never do it. And it's really irritating, right?
I can't hear you. I don't know what happened.
You can't? You can't hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me now, Sam?
Oh, it's my connection.
Oh.
Hopefully it'll come back.
Can you hear me now? Mr. Sam? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Sam, maybe leave and come back. He can't hear me, though. What if I kick you out of here? Can I do that? Disconnect. Can I do that? I do not have access to do that. Shit. Sam, where'd you go? Can anybody else hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, I'm gonna quit Discord real quick and come back on.
Okay. This is funny. I'm gonna wait till he comes back to finish what I was saying, but this is a funny comment. Can you hear me now, Sam? Sam. I don't think he can hear me. I don't think he can hear me. Oh no. What do we do now? I can't hear you either, Sam, if you're speaking. Oh no. I'm going to send you a Meets thing so you can just talk on there.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, you can.
I can. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the point is, so like, I know that certain things have, okay, so this woman comes to my desk every week, and she asks the same questions, and she never pays attention to the answer because she doesn't care, because she's just going to come back next week and ask the same question. It's really irritating. And one week I was having a particularly busy day, and she came over to my desk, and I was like really busy, and I just turned towards her. And she backed away from me as though I had threatened her. And I hated the fact that my brain went to, it matters. Your skin color matters right now. I hated that. Mm-hmm. It made me really uncomfortable because it was like, it's not supposed to matter. But
okay.
So like that to me is an example of how focusing on race can actually make it a lot worse because
But right there's the problem is because look, if we focus on race too much, yes, it can make things worse. If we focus on it not at all, then we risk being overly naive.
I agree
Like,
with that.
it's just a problem, right? Like we have to try to find the right balance, and clearly there's no consensus about what that right balance is, right? Because like the fact that, let's say she did react, and the way that she reacted was conditioned by the color of your skin right there, right? So maybe that has something to do with the fact that in the past or throughout her life growing up in this society, she has been treated differently by people who look like you. If that's true, it's hard to fault her. And
It's not her. It's the
we
problem.
can't fault you because
The problem I have is that if she goes to HR, it's different than if I go to HR. And the fact that if she goes to HR and complains about me because she's a woman and she's black and I'm a man and I'm white, I'm in trouble. And I can't really do anything to defend myself. The best thing I can do is just say I'm sorry. What do I have to do?
Right. And that's unfair. Like if you were to be treated differently just
It's
because
the problem
of
is
that,
less that it's
then I think that
unfair.
would be unfair.
It's less like it being unfair is one thing. That's me. The big problem for me is one, it forces me to consider that it forces me into a situation where our skin color objectively does not matter. And I have to think about that it does. And two, I
What do you mean
know
objectively?
I mean, I know, like, I have to think about that. It matters. If it was a dude,
Well,
if it was another white dude who reacted that way, I wouldn't have to think about it.
okay. And that is what? That
What
is
if it was any
that is
woman?
a reflection
Like,
of the fact that white people and black people and men and women in this society have not historically been treated the same.
All that tells me is that my HR department is untrustworthy and unfair, and that I should
I
be
mean,
but
okay,
that's my entire takeaway is HR isn't for me, it's against me. So fuck HR, and that's not helpful because you need things like HR departments. And then the other thing is, like, I can't help but wonder how many people, and they talk about it later in this book, that there's evidence that that you actually create hostility. And I believe that. I'm absolutely know for sure that there are people who would have had no issue with racism and now are like, you know what, fuck it, fine, it's us against you, fine.
Jimmy, why does it matter that she's a black woman as opposed to a white woman?
It just does. I mean, because intersectionality.
I mean, if anything, I don't know. Maybe like
no,
you could
okay.
argue, like,
I want to respond. There's a
that
comment.
the-
This isn't the point. So this person said, but what if the inconvenience you feel is balanced against the amount of bias that exists against black women in the workplaces? Like you, as a good faith non-racist, are paying a certain price. That's not the point. I don't care about, like, my feelings aside, right? That was annoying for me personally. That was, and whatever. You know, I live in a society. I'm annoyed by lots of things. Everybody on this server knows this. But it's more the fact that I know that this is having a negative impact in a larger way than just me. I know it. I know that people aren't being honest with each other based on race, based on gender. I know it. And that's not a good thing. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying there's no problems with racism. And I'm not saying there's nothing to be gained from thinking about the fact that I don't experience things that black people do. And that I don't know, like, I think absolutely it's very important to be cognizant of that and to think about it and to, like, I don't, and actually it would be better to talk about it openly.
I mean, it's definitely a huge factor in American society, like race. but I'm like not that convinced by your particular example that it was a huge factor in this problem.
What do you mean?
Like, I think if you like scared a white woman, like, and she went to HR, you could be in trouble too. Like, it's
sure.
I don't really think like HR might be like
That's
more,
not true. I can go
know.
through my emails and show you the things we get from HR specifically about race. It's not true. It's created an environment where I, as a white person, don't feel comfortable responding to black people except by saying they're different from me and I have to just shut up.
So, okay.
And again, that's an inconvenience to me. That's fine. It is whatever. It's more that I know that this over a long period of time has an effect on people, and not a good one.
Is this about the book?
No, I was responding to we were talking about the goods and the goods and bads of not treating things, not being colorblind, not being colorblind. Yeah. I think the idea that colorblindness itself is a problem is insane. And I do think there are times where it's like that's a situation.
I just pointed out.
But that's a situation that absolutely should have been colorblind. Is my point.
Why?
Why shouldn't it be?
Because how can we just assume a priori that race is playing absolutely no role in that situation?
You shouldn't make any assumption. That's my point. There should be no assumption.
Then you shouldn't be colorblind, because colorblind is making that assumption.
Well, I mean, in that particular example, like either Jimmy's behaving like really badly towards a coworker, or he's not, and he's just like acting normally. Like, there's not really any racism at like Bay, you know.
The fact that race could be brought up puts me at a disadvantage, which puts me in a situation where I can't be honest about what I think or feel, which puts me in a situation which puts me in a situation which forces the idea that it's us against you.
Can I make a counter argument? Well, maybe the HR department is all, you know, white ladies, and when she goes to HR, she tells her story.
But that's not the case,
you go to HR
though.
and you say, oh no, she's stupid, and I tell her all the time, and the people at HR say, oh yeah, that chick from the city, yeah, she is stupid.
That's not the case, though.
They side with you. They side with you because you're white.
But that's not the case.
To make her argument.
But it's not the case.
I don't think that's the case.
There's no emails about white people being protected from false accusations. There's emails once a month about making sure that you think about black people, right? Like, so one thing is, yes, I think it's absolutely a good thing to think about the fact that that there is differences in race. There absolutely should be. But when it comes to specific instances, specific situations, there should be no assumptions.
Including the assumption that race played no role.
But an accusation...
and there shouldn't also be the assumption that race did play a role.
But the point is, if I'm accused in terms of race being a issue, it is suddenly treated completely differently. Rather than, we're just going to look into it.
Right. It's just a work. I agree with that. It's just a workplace incident.
It should not matter.
They should have treated differently. Based
Bringing
on the
race into it
people
is
involved.
playing a dangerous game.
Yes.
Like, decades of the colorblind approach has extremely diminished white racial consciousness in the nation. The average white person isn't thinking about, oh, white people problems. No, they're thinking about my problems.
I agree with that. I'm not like, again, I'm
colorblind approach.
I'm not
we've
saying
had affirmative action for a long time.
I'm not saying be colorblind. I'm not saying don't list like that. If somebody says this is influenced by race, to ignore that claim and say, well, there isn't that. I am saying that a claim that race is a factor should be no difference than a claim that a weapon is a factor.
It should be right. It should be a claim, and you're saying like let's uphold innocent until proven guilty, and you're saying that that's not what's happening when people bring race into it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Like I could see that being true.
That's where it becomes an issue. And again, here's a note I wrote on this one quote on page 121. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries. I don't know, where's this quote from? I should have written it down.
It's from Delgado. It's from the main Intro to Critical Race Theory book.
Okay. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. And I wrote, this is explicitly prescriptive. It is not descriptive.
Yes.
And that is why I don't like this.
Well, there are many disciplines that are not they're not exclusively descriptive, but also prescriptive.
In
For
philosophy?
instance, climate science, philosophy, ethics, and political philosophy. The whole thing is prescriptive.
Is it?
What does prescriptive mean? It's about what we ought to do, right? That's
Yes.
the whole purview of ethics. What should we do?
but they're basing the prescriptive on the descriptive.
That's, I think, exactly what critical race theory is doing here. It's not only trying to understand our situation, but to change it. Once we understand it, we can figure out how to change it.
Mm-hmm. I don't like that.
I mean, everything is pretty much every discipline, I think, has prescriptive elements, right?
But that's what I
Whenever you're
tried to
saying,
say.
Like something in engineering.
But that's what I tried to
What?
say about postmodernism, that you can't be just descriptive. If you're descriptive, you're implying a prescription.
And that's a fair critique of postmodernism. If they claim not to be prescriptive at all, then it's a totally fair critique. If you think that like everything has a prescriptive element, then the question here would be, what's wrong with critical race theory's prescriptive element?
I would say what's wrong with it is that it hasn't adequately answered the descriptive yet.
Okay, so that's a much more specific and reasonable critique than just to critique it because it's prescriptive.
No, I brought that up because I remember early on that we were talking about, well, this is protected because it's descriptive, it's not prescriptive. But I don't see how you can do one and not the other.
Yeah, that's fair. I would agree with that, I think. And the reason I was like pushing back on that idea against the postmodernists is just because I was trying to like be the one voice in the room, trying to play devil's advocate there.
Mm-hmm.
But like, if what I really think is that, inevitably, if you have like an academic discipline that says it's just doing something descriptive, implicitly at least, there's always going to be the prescriptive there, because you're saying that like the way that we're going about this is the right way to go about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that like future inquiries should be similarly guided, right? Like science itself is obviously going to be prescriptive in the sense that it distinguishes itself from pseudoscience, which it thinks is a bad way to go about trying to interpret the world.
Yes, this was my claim about postmodernism, that you can't actually do it.
Yeah, right. I got you. The point on that page, right, after they talk about transforming it for the better, this is page 121. They say critical race theory sounds rather racist itself in ascribing profound failures of morals and character to white people. I mean, there's a difference between saying that like white people are like have internalized white supremacy by virtue of living in a white supremacist society or something, and to claim that like white people are born racist, and it's like they'll never be able to question these assumptions. And I haven't seen any of those claims yet. But they give a bunch. They say, we are told that racism is embedded in culture and that we cannot escape it. We hear that white people are inherently racist. We are told that racism is prejudice plus power. Therefore, only white people can be racist.
I think
We're
what they're
informed that only people of color can talk about race.
I think
so, like, we are informed of all these things.
Yeah.
Right? Where? Evidence, please.
Well, I think what they're saying is, I know that I've been informed that. I know that
Again, it does every time that this criticism comes up, right? Of my
What is it like
criticism,
Robert
it's like,
D'Angelo?
it doesn't
and, like,
fucking
Kennedy
it doesn't
like
matter
that?
whether we have heard this anecdotally in our lives, because the point of the chapter is to give a descriptive analysis of what is going on in the discipline of critical race theory.
I think that what they're trying to do there is connect the dots. They're saying, like, we are told this, like that. I think it's true. Like, in my opinion, that those things are true. It's not. You can't say that these scholars are telling us that, but we are being.
I think you can.
then
I
it
think
belongs in a
for sure
different
the
chapter.
critical race theory scholars think that America is a white supremacist nation, and black people are are second class citizens. I'm sure that's all over critical race theory.
They think some of these things, but a lot of these things don't come up. And to the point of, like, Robin DiAngelo, right? Robin DiAngelo will call herself a critical race theorist. But the chapter that we're talking about here, critical race theory, is within the purview of applied postmodernism, which they explicitly characterize as the 80s and 90s, the second wave, and the scholarship from 2010 onwards, where we find Robin DiAngelo. That's where Robin DiAngelo comes in, is in chapter 8 as a reified postmodernist. But the problem is they go on to use Robin DiAngelo in this chapter, but this chapter is not supposed to be about that era of postmodernism evolution.
But I think what they're trying to do is connect, like I said, connect the dots. That, like, this leads to this and this leads to this.
But they explicitly characterize things that come from the mouth of Robin DiAngelo after 2010 within the chapter about critical race theory that is supposed to be applied postmodernism from the 80s and 90s.
Well, I think I don't know where the chapters that said this is supposed to be from the 80s and 90s. Like, the chapter is called critical race theory.
It's the introduction, right? The introduction, they say, we will address these things in 3 waves. First, chapter 1 deals with postmodernism. Then chapter 2 discusses applied postmodernism, and it gives you the sort of window of it from the 80s and 90s. And then you have 5 chapters of different disciplines of applied postmodernism, or different lenses, right? And then the next one, the third and final wave of reified postmodernism from the 2010s on.
Yeah, but aren't they trying to claim that all of these 5 fields are what influenced what they talk about in chapter 8?
Reified postmodernism. Yes, of course. But when they talk about Robin DiAngelo, they don't make the distinction that, oh, this is what Robin DiAngelo says, this is how applied postmodernism goes on to manifest in reified postmodernism, as we will discuss in chapter 8. They say these things about Robin DiAngelo. Let me find where they come up. 132 to 133. They talk about the paranoid mindset. Second paragraph of 132. Critical race theory's hallmark paranoid mindset, which assumes racism is everywhere, always, just waiting to be found. What's their evidence of critical race theorists actually having this paranoid mindset? Well, it comes at the bottom of that page when they talk about scholar activists Heather Bruce, Robin DiAngelo, Gaida Swaney, and Amy Thurber put it at the Race and Pedagogy Conference in 2015, where they say the question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? So this is what they're characterizing as critical race theory's paranoid mindset. But it comes in reified postmodernism, not in the applied postmodernism. So they give evidence of it earlier when they talk about the tenets of critical race theory. One of them is that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, which means racism is sort of the default rather than the out of the ordinary, right? The extraordinary. Because according to like colorblind liberalism, right, you would say that like, oh, everyone's treated as equal in this society, but there are some people who are racist, right? And so sometimes racism affects people in a bad way. That's seeing racism as sort of out of the ordinary. The critical race theorists want to say that actually, for American history, racism has been the default. And what's out of the ordinary is racism actually not being present, right? But I think what they're doing is they're reading back into this claim that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, the more extreme claim that comes from D'Angelo, which is that racism is everywhere always. And the question is not, did it take place, but how did it take place?
Okay. I get your point. I still see it as just that this paragraph is sort of saying like, we could argue about this forever. I think it's at least it's at most unclear.
At most?
Yeah. Or okay, at least unclear.
I think it's at least unclear. At most, it's like outright distortion. Right?
I mean, I read that and I think that they're saying like this happened then, and now today we are told these things. It sounds like they're connected.
Right. It sounds like it's all critical race theory.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. That's a fair
I
criticism.
mean, it's a chapter on critical race theory.
Yeah, no. I guess it's. I read it more as that influenced this.
Right, which they do end up saying later on, but here in this chapter, it sounds like, I mean, they say critical race theory's paranoid mindset. Yeah. One thing I need to add on page 128 when they talk about intersectionality.
Yeah, that whole can of worms. Most of the
so
chapters
they say
on
that intersectionality reduces everything to one single variable, one single topic of conversation, one single focus and interpretation. Prejudice as understood under the power dynamics asserted by theory. Thus, for example, disparate outcomes can have one and only one explanation, and it is prejudicial bigotry. So the only person I've ever seen argue this is Ibram X. Kendi, and he's nowhere cited in this book. So I have a hard time thinking that there's reason for me to accept that critical race theory reduces everything, or intersectionality reduces everything to one single variable. And as a matter of fact, later on, towards the end of the chapter, they actually have an endnote where they cite Kimberly Crenshaw saying that she was misinterpreted by a lot of like activists.
Yeah.
To think that intersectionality is a theory of everything. But here, they're talking about the original people who invented intersectionality, and they're saying that it does reduce everything to one single variable.
Well, here's why I sort of agree with what they're saying. So the way I visualize, I think in pictures. So the way I visualize intersectionalities is, if you think of a graph that on the one end is the most oppressed or victims of prejudice, right? And on the other end, it's the least. If you have access to the full graph, but you have very low resolution dots on the graph to tell you anything. So there's a giant dot that says white, and there's a giant dot that says black, and there's and then if you add more to it, you can get to the point where every dot is actually a person, and you can see where they are on that sort of spectrum.
But so where did you get the idea that this is how intersectionality works?
But isn't that the whole point? Like the point.
Kimberly Crenshaw like coined the phrase just to point out that like sometimes there are kinds of oppression that cannot be explained by looking at single axes of oppression. So it might be the case that a black woman is not experiencing like some of the oppression because she's black and some of the oppression because she's a woman, but that uniquely it is the intersection of black identity with woman identity that is actually being excluding here. And there's like she cites a clear example where like obviously in that case she's right. It's like the company was hiring white women and the company was hiring black men. So the company tried to claim that it couldn't have been discriminating against this woman because it had black employees and it had female employees, right? But the female employees were all white, and the black employees were all male. So like that's a clear example, and her examples that she originates this with are all super reasonable. And I mean, Pluckrose and Lindsay even like sort of give her a head nod to that like intersectionality at its base makes sense. But then later on, they're saying that intersectionality reduces everything to one variable.
Well, I mean, in the way that it's used, in my experience,
right.
it
Okay.
does
So
do
finally, again. So, if that's true, it doesn't fucking matter because this chapter does not purport to be describing, anecdotal experiences or anything like that. It purports
But why
to be
doesn't it
explaining
matter?
scholarship.
But if your scholarship leads to, really bad.
So, right, if that's
philosophy,
true, then argue that in your fucking book. Write a book about people misinterpreting scholarship, not about scholarship.
I do hear your criticism. It's
like this happens in every fucking chapter.
Yeah. I do understand. They're not making their claim clear. They could have made a better claim that they could really justify that this is leading to some crazy things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And
but yeah,
on,
it would be fair in the same way that you could say, well, nuclear science has led to some really fucking crazy shit. Maybe we should be a little careful about it. But you couldn't use that to say that
they instead wrote the books that said like the nuclear scientists were arguing that we should drop bombs on Hiroshima or some shit. Like,
yes, yeah, that's. I mean, there's some accountability there, but it's not the amount that they're making it out to be.
Because the whole claim of the book is to trace these ideas back to the scholarship. So in explaining the scholarship, you need to say what the scholars said.
Yeah,
now, if you want to make the claim that these people have misinterpreted the scholars, then make that claim.
That's such a... I'm actually frustrated.
It's like they made a whole book about how to use the Mott and Bailey effectively.
Yeah.
I don't think it's true because, for example, with Judith Butler, she has some money quotes about gender being just performative and not genetic at all. So when people dunk on gender for being actually being biology based.
My criticism.
Well, but they went way beyond saying that gender is not biological, right? Like if all they said about Judith Butler was that she said gender is not biological, like yeah, okay, she says that. You can give a quote, like you can substantiate that. But they went way further than that.
My problem is that like you can't. God, it's so.
It's like, Jimmy, I think I know, like, your frustration is like, look, you approach this book in a way that, because when you think about postmodernism, you don't think about how the authors themselves, who are being called postmodernism, defined it, right? You don't think about that. You think about it in terms of more practical terms of, like, what that gets called critical race theory or queer theory do you see, like, in the real world? But the difference between you and Lindsay and Pluckrose is that they don't share that interpretation of language. When they talk about critical race theory, they take themselves to be talking about critical race theorists, the scholarship that they produced, and that's that's it, right? Like then there's the activists who interpret critical race theory, but that's different. That's a different world to them. So
Yeah.
I mean, like
No,
they take themselves to be disagreeing with your theory of like what words mean and shit, and yet
I think the criticism that could be
only
levied
way
at
their
these
view is
academics.
plausible, yeah.
I think the criticism that could be levied at these academics is that more. It's become obvious that there's some dangerous things happening that are rooted in some of your philosophy, and it would behoove you to make it clear that this is not what you are talking about. And like you said, it looks like they have tried to. I guess it's concerning. Oh God, stop with the messaging me, Jesus.
I mean, like, I take it we agree, like, the book that they wrote is not the book that they say they wrote.
Well, it's. I guess I didn't think that the book was going to be an attempt to take out theories, because that just seems like a foolish enterprise. I thought that it was going to be an attempt to illustrate how certain theories are being used to fuel some really terrifying stuff.
And to some extent, they do engage in a little bit of that, but the vast majority of the book, at least, purports to actually explain the scholarship itself, where they find the roots of these activism, these like problematic manifestations of activism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the
see, I can't help but compare it to Coddling of the American Mind, because I feel like Coddling of the American Mind achieved what it set out to achieve, because it had a realistic goal.
I haven't read it, but I mean, I've listened to talks that Jonathan Haidt has given that seem to be sort of like a precis of some component of that book, where it seems to be that the narrative that he puts forward is much more plausible, and it has a lot less to do with the content of any academic discipline and more to do with like huge sweeping societal changes, like the advent of social media and the generation that has grown up with it at its fingertips.
Right. And when it talks about academia, it makes very specific claims. It talks about like they do talk about intersectionality in that book. And they actually give Crenshaw a lot of credit, and they give the idea credit, but then they explain how it's being taught in specific ways and why that way of teaching it is such a problem.
So they clearly distinguish between the original intent of intersectionality and the way that it might be misconstrued, and that it's the latter that's clearly causing a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think you need to involve intent here. They could have had all sorts of ill intent. I guess it doesn't matter to me. Ultimately,
I just mean the intent with respect to what the concept of intersectionality actually was supposed to be interpreted as.
Yeah, I guess. Well, they talk about the good and the bad of intersectionality, and when they talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, it is specifically about the idea of intersectionality that they're behind.
That who's behind?
That Haidt and Luke Kianoff are in agreement with.
Haidt and Luke Kianoff.
Yes, that they're in agreement with, like, this
is
a useful way of understanding some things.
And then they distinguish that from the sort of application of intersectionality to mean, for instance, constructing a sort of oppression Olympics or something like that.
Yeah, there's actually a like a figure, like a picture of an actual thing from a course. It looks like a butthole. Made me laugh because it's like it's just lines intersecting, and it looks like a butthole because it's, you know, it's just like a bunch of
Oh, I
lines.
think I've seen this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's and it's just like ableist, you know, able and disabled, and like it literally makes it binary on two sides of everything, you know.
Yeah. So to just wrap things up real quick, like so I already talked about the straw man of Crenshaw, where they say that intersectionality is trying to reduce everything to one variable. Then they go on to describe this caste system of social justice, right? This is like this sort of oppression Olympics idea. They're saying, look, sometimes some people have argued that gay white men and non-black people of color need to recognize their privilege, and straight black men have been described as the white people of black people. And it's not uncommon to hear that trans men need to recognize that they've ascended to male privilege. And all of the citations that they're giving here are to like blog posts and shit. Like none of this is academic articles. And they're supposed to be describing critical race theory, right? The stuff from now they could be saying that this has, like, that critical race theory has led to this, but I haven't, like, they definitely don't make that clear. And it seems to me that they're saying like this is critical race theory, or intersectionality, right? And then they say, yeah, so they're seeking to establish a caste system based on theorized states of oppression. And then on page 130, they say that by the methods of intersectionality, the unique individual is not really understood as an individual at all. The number of axes of social division under intersectionality can be almost infinite, but they cannot be reduced to the individual. They say theory insists that only by understanding the various groups and the social constructions around those groups can one truly understand society. And so there's no such thing as the individual at all. Do they cite any scholars, or actually even anyone here? No.
I think they're saying that that's what's extrapolated from it. I get you.
Then finally, on page 133, right after they discuss the Robin DiAngelo idea that racism always took place and it's just about how it took place, they say, this is towards the bottom of 133, because the member of the marginalized racial group is said to have a unique voice and a counter-narrative that, under theory, must be regarded as authoritative to the degree that it is theoretically authentic, the postmodern knowledge principle. What? There is no real way to dispute her reading of the situation. This is just straight up like taking the problem of white fragility and attributing it to intersectionality and critical race theory. Like, I don't see anyone who says that, actually, you just can't disagree. And as we'll see in chapter 8, that's what they point out that is distinctively problematic about reified postmodernism or social justice scholarship, is that they claim that social justice scholars or reified postmodernists actually think that it's not possible to disagree with the oppressed, or with people of color, or with whatever the marginalized identity is, or to even disagree with the branch of theory that the person is espousing. But this is coming in the applied postmodernism chapter here.
Well, can we talk about that for a second? Because I remember when the whole George Floyd shit went down, there was some girl from Jamaica, and she wrote an article for it was published in the op-ed of the New York Times. She's like, "I'm leaving the United States. Y'all a bunch of racists. I'm out of here." And she listed all the reasons, where she was prejudiced against and stuff. So people, I follow on Twitter, they're all like, they're like laughing about her and stuff. But not laughing, but they were they disagreed with her that America was racist and stuff. But from your perspective, I think most people, most liberals wouldn't disagree with her that they would say, oh, that's her perspective. She's So I do think, from what I can tell, there is a hesitance to criticize minorities.
Right. No, I don't disagree with that at all, right? I think that it is prevalent.
my only point is that this chapter is not supposed to be about what is happening in everyday life and how like white liberals are acting based on this scholarship or not. This chapter is supposed to be about critical race theory and its theoretical basis, right? And what the actual critical race theorists themselves are saying. So,
Yeah, I feel like,
I mean, I made this point like 40 times throughout this series.
yeah, no, it's a little frustrating because I feel like, what do you think about this? I think it would have been more useful to, in each of these chapters, just described what these theories are, and then shown actual examples today and how they see them connecting to the theory.
That would be a much more honest project.
Yeah, that would have been a better book. I mean, that's kind of what I expected it to be, and I feel like they're sort of trying to do that, but they're not. It's really actually kind of frustrating. Is like,
it not like a series of Mott and Bailey over and over and over again? It's like they say, look, these theorists say this, and then I'm like, well, where in the theory do they say it? And they're like, come on, I mean, people read them as saying that.
Yeah, I do hear your. I wanted to say a couple things. On page 131, they talk. There's what's his name or her name? Ange Marie Hancock. Is that how you say her name? Angie Marie. Angie
Marie Hancock. Okay.
Yeah.
Or Ange Marie.
Yeah. There's a quote from her here that I thought was really helpful. Let's see if I can find it. The danger of whitening intersectionality and taking it from the experiences that black women have, blah, 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 blah. Hancock notes intersectionality has gone viral. I mean, I agree with that. It has. And has rapidly taken on new and unexpected applications, especially in activism, many of which are justified by the academic literature of the subject. Okay, you probably would contest that claim and you'd want them to back it up.
Well,
but
let's see. Intersectionality has gone viral, and many of which are... Well, I mean, maybe it is, but I mean, yeah, like, just please, evidence.
Mm-hmm. I guess I wrote what I wrote. It looks like Hancock and Crenshaw, but they're sort of critiquing what their work is being used for, and I was like, that's what we need to happen. And then
Right.
What was this about?
But then in the very next paragraph, they go back to critical race theory and the paranoid mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, if they took everything after this to be like, okay, like you should know that now we're not talking about critical race theory, we're talking about the way that people have opportunistically distorted it for their own ends or whatever, then that seems to be entirely given up in the very next paragraph on 132, because they say critical race theory is hallmark paranoid mindset, right? Like, if they were in the previous paragraph talking about misinterpretations of it, then in the next one they seem to be right back to actually what it is at its core.
Mm-hmm.
I actually do have kind of a problem with the title of the book, I guess, in the sense, because they often, like, they create, cynical theories. So they're, these people are being, paranoid and stuff. I guess it's not cynical if it's true. Like, so I don't, like, it seems like they should spend more time, like, proving their theories, false, about, Judith Butler's theory about, they just kind of,
They
do
take
the
it to be like
the basic.
self-evidently false.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about I know that bringing up D'Angelo. I understand your criticism of that, but this conference, I mean, does that not seem at least somewhat indicative of the problems they're talking about?
Yeah. So they should bring up that conference in chapter 8.
Yeah. I'm guessing they don't. Yeah. The only other things I had on the very last page, it's hard too, because like, I agree with you. They're sort of not staying on topic. Yeah.
Yeah, in all of my friend Oliver Chaldy's review, which I think, if anything, was like too generous to them, he says something about how this book reads like it's like 47 different like standalone essays just sort of glued together. Like oftentimes they like go off track or they repeat themselves.
I agree with
like,
that.
Yeah.
It's
Like,
it's frustrating because there's like little.
I read like Atlantic articles like about like, you know, the hot topic and stuff. A lot of the this is it gets better, but a lot of like the worst chapters seem like they could have been just like an article in the Atlantic about like critical race theory. Like, it doesn't seem like that in depth.
So like this part really got me, and at the very end. But again, they're talking about now, so it's out of context in this chapter. But it's to me true. Some studies have already shown that diversity courses in which members of dominant groups are told that racism is everywhere and that they themselves perpetuate it have resulted in increased hostility towards marginalized groups. I've found that to be absolutely true. But but worse than that. And then he says, it is bad psychology to tell people who do not believe that they are racist, who may even actively despise racism, that there is nothing they can do to stop themselves from being racist. And then ask them to help you. I know. We're not going to attribute this to critical race theory in the way that they have. It is even less helpful to tell them that even their own good intentions are proof of their latent racism. Worst of all is to set up double binds, like telling them if they notice race, it is because they are racist. But if they don't notice race, it is because of their privilege affords them the luxury of not noticing race, which is racist. I agree with this final thing, and I like know people. It's worse than actually creating enemies because it creates really bad allies, clout chasers.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean Rachel Dolezal, Jessica Krug. The news has been dominated. There's a person in my area who's pretty, he's pretty influential in certain circles, and he's a fucking clout chaser, and he fucking came at me on social media.
Sean King.
Sean King is a great example. I hate that guy.
No, I agree absolutely. Yeah, like this stuff is problematic. I think like the kinds of diversity trainings that have become super popular are toxic. Like Robin DiAngelo's diversity trainings are fucking idiotic.
Yeah. I'm glad we at least agree on that, and I understand your frustration with this book. It is frustrating to me too. I really think that's my takeaway so far, is that each one of these chapters would have been better if they had just described the theories and then explained things that are actually happening on campus today, and explained why they see a connection in a subjective way. And I think that would have been a much more effective work.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we have been on for 3 hours and 10 minutes.
3 hours.
So I think I'm going to end it because my ears hurt and I'm tired.
I need to eat some food.
Yeah, same. Anyway, Sam, thanks for doing this. Thanks everybody else.
Hey, thanks everyone.
Next week is, let's see, what is next week? We've
got feminisms and gender studies and disability and fat studies.
And I'm assuming it's just more of the same.
We'll find out. These are actually the chapters I had read least carefully in the book. So we'll see.
It's really the following week I am the most interested in. It's chapter 8.
Yeah, social justice scholarship. Oh, chapter 8, baby.
Yeah, chapter 8 is the big. They even they acknowledge it many times in this book that chapter 8 is the chapter.
That's the big kahuna.
Yeah. And your article is mostly focused on that as well. So, okay, next week we'll go over feminisms and whatever the hell the other one was, and
right, disability and fat studies, the thing that's taken over colleges.
Fat studies is stupid. Let's be real.
We'll find out.
I was fat. Fat studies is stupid. Okay.
I was fat too. All right, everyone.
All right.
Stay safe.
Adios.
And make sure you put condoms on your glasses when you're reading. All right.
Oh, man.
Woo.
Who said that?
Me.
Who is that? I can't see. Oh. I appreciated
Hello.
your comment in there. You kind of came and saved me.
What was it?
It was when I was talking about my experiences at work.
Oh, yeah. I find a lot of race talk to. I can understand the perspective of like wanting to take it into account because of historical injustices, but it opens up a door to the other half of the equation, and no one wants that.
Totally agree.
So-
Totally agree.